pass into the noon hour. And we're back in session on agenda item, excuse me. What? So we're going to take things out of order. We're going to, as we've been doing all day for the most part, moving to agenda item 9. This is the time and place for hearing to consider adoption of new general waste discharge requirements for bovine feeding operations within the Central Valley. Is there anyone present who is contesting the proposed actions and wishes to present evidence or testimony on this matter? If there is, please stand up. Good. We have somebody here. Good. Otherwise, it's a 5-minute item. This hearing will be conducted in accordance with the notice of public hearing and the meeting procedures published with the meeting agenda. At this time, evidence should be introduced on whether the proposed action should be taken. All persons expecting to testify, please stand at this time, raise your right hand, and take the following oath. Do you swear the testimony you're about to give is the truth? If so, answer, I do. Thank you. Following the staff presentation, there will be a bovine feed industry panel. We offered a panel to the EJ folks, but they stated that they would testify individually. Interested persons will be allowed 3 minutes each to address the board, and a timer will be used. Please state your name, address, affiliation, and whether you've taken the oath before you testify. Does council have any legal issues to discuss at this time?
Not at this time.
Thank you. We'll now begin with the staff presentation.
Good afternoon, Chairman Longley and members of the board. My name is Charlene Herbst. I'm the Senior Engineering Geologist with the Confined Animal Facilities Unit in the Rancho Cordova office, and I have taken the oath. This presentation discusses a proposed general order for confined bovine feeding operations. The presentation provides a general background on the contents of the bovine order, followed by a discussion of the major comments we received and the modifications made to the order in response to those comments. The Central Valley region has a large number of confined animal operations, and the Central Valley Water Board has a long history of regulating them under Title 27 to prevent or minimize impacts to surface water and groundwater. While milk cow dairies have been regulated under a region-wide general order since 2007, there has not been a similar general order for other types of confined bovine operations. These operations include feedlots, calf ranches, heifer operations, and auction markets. They house beef cattle, calves, and heifers, which are cows that have not yet had a calf, in corrals or similar confined areas. The calves and heifers raised at bovine operations are frequently grown as support stock for dairies. The bovine order regulates a subset of confined bovine operations termed confined bovine feeding operations. There are several components to the definition of a confined bovine feeding operation. First, the operation must be a commercial facility that houses bovine animals. 4-H projects and similar small educational operations are not required to get coverage under the bovine order. The operation must have 6 or more animal units of bovine animals. The concept of an animal unit will be discussed more in the next slide. Finally, the animals must be confined and fed for 45 days or more in a 12-month period. The minimum 45-day period is designed to eliminate facilities that operate only briefly during the year. For example, grazing operations that occasionally house animals in corrals during the winter for supplemental feeding are not subject to the bovine order. Similarly, county fairs that only house animals during events are also excluded from the order. The definition of confined bovine feeding operations excludes operations that keep bovine animals exclusively on pasture. By definition, confined feeding operations rely on imported feed for animals as opposed to allowing animals to graze. Because the bovine order covers operations housing many breeds and ages of animals, the order uses animal units to describe the number of animals at an operation. The weights in column 2 are from the back of attachment A of the order, the notice of intent, and represent the average maximum weight of an animal in that age category. Column 3 indicates the approximate number of different types of animals that make 6 animal units, the smallest size operation covered by the order. Column 4 indicates the approximate number that make 100 animal units, the smallest sized operation to require full general order coverage. Operations housing between 6 and 99 animal units are expected to qualify for the limited population tier. That tier is described in more detail in a following slide. Operations having 5 or fewer animal units would not be subject to the bovine order. As you can see, the bovine order would regulate operations having about 30 or more young calves, 18 or more older calves, 8 or more heifers, or 5 or more steers. Full general order coverage would be required for operations having about 475 young calves, 285 older calves, 135 heifers, or 80 steers. Because of the wide variation in the numbers and ages of animals and the types of management practices at bovine operations, the bovine order divides operations into 3 categories based on threat to water quality: limited time operations, limited population operations, and operations requiring full general order coverage. The criteria for each category is discussed in the following slides. Some bovine operations, particularly auction markets, do not continually house animals or may have only limited numbers of animals during certain times of the month, allowing for thorough cleaning of animal housing during those times. If such operations also include other practices that reduce the threat to water quality, the operation may be classified as a limited time operation under the bovine order. To qualify for this classification, the operation must store manure either in a roofed structure or on a low permeability surface where it is either removed or covered with a waterproof covering prior to any forecasted major storm event. To qualify for this classification, any on-site composting must be conducted either in an enclosed area, which would be exempt, or in accordance with the State Board's general waste discharge requirements for composting operation if the composting does not qualify for an exemption. No wastewater, other than stormwater runoff from corrals and de minimis amounts of water from sanitization, can be generated at a limited time operation and stored on site. Operations that meet the criteria to qualify as limited time operations are subject to reduced requirements for record keeping and monitoring and submit simplified annual reports. Bovine operations that house between 6 and 99 animal units may be classified as a limited population operation under the bovine order if the operation also implements practices that reduce the threat to water quality. The protective practices that the operation must implement to qualify for this tier include preparing and following an operation and maintenance plan to ensure that manure and stormwater runoff from corrals is managed in a way that is protective of water quality. Any on-site composting must meet requirements similar to those outlined for limited time operations in the preceding slide. No wastewater other than stormwater runoff from corrals can be generated at a limited population operation and stored on site. Operations that meet the criteria to qualify as limited population operations are subject to minimal requirements for record keeping and monitoring and are not required to submit annual reports. Except for the requirement to develop and implement an operation and maintenance plan, this is essentially a registration tier. Bovine operations that house 100 or more animal units at any given time, or smaller operations having 6 or more animal units that do not meet the criteria to be classified as a limited time or limited population operation must comply with all of the provisions of the general order. The requirements for a bovine operation that has full general order coverage are very similar to those in the 2013 reissued dairy general order. The bovine order requires the preparation and submittal by dischargers of a waste management plan describing how waste is collected, stored, and protected from flooding within the production area. The production area is the location at a bovine operation where animals are housed and waste is stored. The bovine order requires the discharger to prepare and implement a nutrient management plan for cropland where manure and wastewater are applied. The order includes monitoring, sampling, and reporting requirements to verify that the requirements of the order are being met, and the submittal of portions of that information to the board in annual reports. The order includes provisions requiring groundwater monitoring, either by individual bovine operations or by a coalition monitoring a representative number of bovine operations. No single state agency or private entity maintains a comprehensive list of all bovine operations within the Central Valley. Of the 4 main classes of bovine operations, which are auction markets, beef feedlots, calf operations, and heifer operations, a comprehensive list is only available for auction markets. Of the 25 auction markets in the Central Valley region, the largest number are located in Stanislaus and Tulare County. Most auction markets are expected to qualify for the limited time operations classification. To estimate the number of bovine operations housing 100 or more animal units and thus requiring full general order coverage, staff worked with staff from the California Department of Food and Agriculture to review in-house records and air photos in 17 of the 36 counties that are entirely or partially within the boundaries of the Central Valley region. The counties reviewed were those anticipated to have the largest number of bovine operations. The results of that review are summarized in the far right column. The operations were not further subdivided by the number of animals on site. Operations vary widely in size within the category of full general order coverage, with the largest beef feedlot housing in excess of 100,000 animals. Because of the lack of any centralized database on smaller bovine operations housing between 6 and 99 animal units that would be classified as limited population operations, the number of such operations has only been roughly estimated at 400.
Sherlyn, can I ask you a question? Can you go back to the slide?
Sure.
The limited time operation auction markets, you
Yes.
mentioned it is expected that they would comply. Is that because they are already doing the different steps, or are they going to have to step up their game a little bit to comply?
We anticipate that they'll qualify because they don't house animals continuously except for a very few number, because we were able to speak with the representative of the Auction Market Association, and he could tell us, yes, they mostly store stormwater, they're empty except for sale days, and so verbally it looks like the bulk of them will qualify. So
Okay.
it's from information we receive from the industry that we anticipate that.
Okay, thank you.
The bovine order does include some additional provisions that are different from those in the reissued dairy general order. This slide summarizes the main provisions. The bottom of existing ponds may not intersect groundwater. Composting must meet the state board's composting general order or qualify for an exemption. Flow meters are required to measure applications of wastewater to cropland. Annual sampling of soil for nitrogen is required, and more extensive monitoring of surface water discharges for ammonia and pesticides is required. The tentative bovine order was released for public comment on 10 February 2017. Legal notices about the tentative order were published in 11 newspapers. The notice of public hearing was sent to 36 county ag commissioners and to the 728 contacts on the electronic LIRIS list for confined animal facilities issues. An additional 18 entities, including CDFA, the Air Resources Board, Cal Recycle, environmental and industry groups, consultants, and individuals were also notified. During the 8-week public comment period, 10 interested parties submitted comment letters. Similar comments were grouped and written responses were prepared for the 49 resulting comments. Major comments and staff's responses are summarized on the following 14 slides. A complete review of the comments received and staff's responses are included in the agenda package. Several commenters asserted that the anti-degradation analysis in the order is inadequate. The information sheet has been revised to include additional language describing the direct application of the anti-degradation policy to the bovine order. In light of the significant variation in surface and groundwater quality over the geographic areas covered by the order, staff proceeded with its anti-degradation analysis based on the reasonably supported conclusion that the discharges from bovine operations would degrade at least some high-quality waters. Revisions to the information sheet provided an expanded explanation for why the management practices and other requirements in the bovine order represent best practicable treatment or control to minimize degradation. Revisions to the information sheet also provided an expanded explanation as to why limited degradation to high-quality waters from the discharges authorized under the bovine order is consistent with the maximum benefit to the people of the state. Where waters are not high quality and therefore not subject to the anti-degradation policy, dischargers are required to use best efforts, including time schedules for improvements. Multiple commenters stated that the order is too expensive and represents an undue economic burden. Staff recognize that implementation of the order will lead to an increase in the cost of production. However, in view of the environmental benefits and the protection of water quality that should result from implementation of the order, staff believe the additional costs are justified. Efforts have been made to minimize the economic impact to that which is justified by the environmental benefits. The order includes tiers for facilities that are viewed as a lower threat to water quality due to less than continuous operations or small populations of animals. Operations placed in these tiers have reduced monitoring, record keeping, and reporting requirements. The analysis of implementation costs in the information sheet has been expanded to include the capital cost of installing several types of wastewater ponds that could be required at bovine operations subject to the order. If board members wish to go into detail about costs, we have the cost table from the information sheet available at the end of the presentation. Commenters were divided on the appropriateness of the regulatory threshold of 6 animal units used in the bovine order. 2 commenters felt the regulatory threshold should be raised to 100 animal units, an option considered during development of the order. Another commenter expressed support for the regulatory threshold of 6 animal units. Staff evaluated a number of different options for the minimum size of a bovine operation that should be subject to the general order. Because even small facilities can pose a threat to water quality if not properly maintained, the order compromises by using a low threshold of 6 animal units, but allows the smallest facilities to be placed in the limited population tier with minimal requirements beyond developing and implementing an operation and maintenance plan to help ensure proper site maintenance. Note that a bovine operation that would otherwise qualify for the limited time or limited population tiers may be removed from that tier and required to comply with the full requirements of the bovine order if the operation poses a greater threat to water quality than is consistent with those tiers. Commenters were concerned about how operations were defined. One commenter was concerned that dischargers would fragment a single operation into several adjoining operations to avoid falling within the full general order coverage classification. To prevent this situation, an additional criterion has been added to finding 5 to prevent an operation from artificially dividing so that it can be classified as several limited population operations. Another commenter wanted the order to clearly describe when a bovine operation, such as a calf or heifer raising facility, can be included in a dairy's permit, as opposed to being regulated separately under the bovine order. Additional language has been added to Finding 12 to describe the situations where a bovine operation can be included as part of a dairy permitted under the Dairy General Order.
I have a question, a couple of questions at this point.
Yes.
If this, when we talk about a bovine operation, if one were to have pastured animals, would this still apply?
No, animals that are on pasture are not subject to the bovine order.
And so how do we, so we're really talking about animal density then, and how do we define the difference where we have corralled animals and animals on pastures?
The usual definition, and I believe it's the definition in the back of the order, I'd have to check, is related to the amount of vegetative coverage in the area where the animals are, whether they have to be receive supplemental feed, or whether there is enough material there for them to graze.
And if I have 20 animals, but I say these are all pets, do I still fall under the order?
So you're not a commercial operation?
Yes, that's it, yeah.
They would not fall under the order if they're not a commercial operation, if they're all your buddies.
All my buddies, yeah. I'm thinking of some specific cases that get clarification on them. Thank you.
A commenter noted that some auction markets may have a few animals present on any given day of the calendar month, because sometimes animals are not picked up after an auction due to causes such as a bounced check or a lack of proper transportation. The commenter also noted that the presence of such a small number of animals does not prevent the thorough cleaning and ongoing maintenance that is the basis of the reduced requirements for limited time operations. Language has been added to Finding 4A, allowing animals, up to 10% of the existing herd size, to be housed at any time at a limited time operation as long as cleanup and maintenance are not hindered. A commenter felt that limited population operations should, at a minimum, be required to annually test any wells on their property and store the results with the rest of their documentation for review by regional board staff. Staff acknowledges that testing of on-property domestic and agricultural wells provides useful information on regional groundwater quality. However, staff feels that sampling data from full general order coverage bovine operations, when combined with sampling information already being collected at dairies, will provide sufficient regional groundwater data. In the event that additional groundwater information is needed, language has been added to Monitoring Requirements Section E3 of the Monitoring and Reporting Program to indicate that limited population and limited time operations shall monitor groundwater if directed by the executive officer. Commenters disagreed on the appropriateness of the schedule for implementation in the bovine order. Some felt that the due dates on the schedule should be extended to reduce negative practical and financial impacts on the industry. Some felt the schedule should be shortened because of the threat to water quality posed by currently unpermitted bovine facilities, particularly to neighboring communities. After reviewing and considering all the comments received, staff has extended the deadlines for submittal of major documents by 6 to 18 months, depending on the complexity of the document. The most important extensions are described later in the presentation with other late revisions. The deadlines have been extended to allow the industry time to comply and to spread out the cost of compliance. The schedule is designed to accommodate the need for education of and outreach to a previously unpermitted industry. Note that dischargers may be required to make changes in their management practices sooner than the schedule in the order, if data from this or other monitoring programs identify practices that are not protective of groundwater quality. Several commenters stated that the regional board should provide or develop new, standardized, and user-friendly reporting forms for annual reports, nutrient management plans, and waste management plans. At this time, funding is not available to pay for the development of electronic forms such as those developed by Merced County for the use of dairies using funding provided by the State Board. Regional Board staff will be pursuing funding to create such forms. Meanwhile, staff is available to review and provide feedback on applications and tools such as modifications of the Merced County forms if developed by other entities.
I'd like to address that, and I thank you for the clarification that we will be seeking funding, BCP, I would presume, to address that, that issue. I think, first of all, it's important that the data come in a similar form, and I understand with the ILRP that some of the consultants have put together their own forms, but in general, they follow the format of the form that was developed through the Merced County effort. It's important that the data looks kind of alike, just from being able to analyze that data. Otherwise, staff's going to have to go back and reformat an awful lot of stuff, and that takes time and effort on the board staff. I think that it's incumbent upon us to find a way to get those funds pretty quick, so we're not wasting board time simply trying to analyze the data that's coming in. It's to have a standardized form, I think, is, sum it up, extremely important.
Several commenters requested the deletion of the 1.4 ratio of nitrogen applied to nitrogen removed in the harvested portion of the crop. Instead, the commenters favored requirements to measure and report applications of nutrients to and removal of nutrients in the crop, but without a specific target ratio. The requirement of 1.4 in the order is a target, and it is recognized that it is not always achievable. The basis for the 1.4 ratio is the University of California report, which indicated that the appropriate nitrogen loading rate that minimizes nitrogen leaching and maximizes nitrogen in harvested material is between 140% and 150% of the nitrogen removed in the harvested material.
On that issue, the A over R, or applied over removed, is a lot of discussion of that in the ILRP. Where are we on that discussion at this point in time? Can somebody answer that for me? That's an Adam question. You can't get away from us, Adam.
I'm sorry, Dr. Longley, I heard half the question.
Okay, on the LRP program, we had the request on this program. Folks wanted to go to the A over R. Where are we on that discussion now? Because I would presume that whatever we do in irrigated lands would transfer to this program down the road, possibly in that nitrogen application question.
Right now, with respect to irrigated lands, we don't have this type of figure. What we do have is an outreach process where we're gathering information. We're getting A over Y data and A over R applied versus removed data from the ag groups. And that information is going to feed into, currently we're going to be looking at outliers and, where some folks are higher or much higher than other growers growing the same type of crop in the same areas. We're going to go into an outreach phase to try and bring them down. The general idea is over time, what we'll have is some information on what people can achieve and things like that. And the MPEP, which you'll hear an information item on this in a little bit, is going to be looking at actual practices, how those types of practices can be implemented, and presumably coming up with practices and potentially some sort of measure like this. So that's where we're at. I would say that in the ag program, we're a little further behind. This ratio that was developed by UC Davis considered a relatively small subset of crops that are grown on dairy lands, and in the ag program we have a lot more crop types.
So I guess my question is, why are we different in this program than with the other program? Do we have more certainty with this program?
I can't answer the certainty question. I do know that this program, actually this 1.4 was developed before the ag program the long-term ag program was in place. And I would say that, and I'm not there, I can't say with certainty, but the 1.4 was developed on a smaller subset of crops by researchers, and I believe that we have, I don't know, ultimately many more crops in the irrigated lands program that we'll have to think about what this ratio should be.
Yeah.
Dr.
This is nothing
Longley?
but a guess, but I guess different soil types too, I would think.
Dr. Longley, this is Clay Rogers, AEO in Fresno, and I'll add just a little bit more to that. One, in the dairy order, it wasn't a target. There was a regulatory effort behind it. You were to stay below 1.65, and there was that range of 1.4 to 1.65. Here, we did make it a target. The idea really is that we have the representative monitoring program in the dairy order and proposed here in the bovine order that will actually, we look to that program to tell us what are the appropriate removal rates and application rates in order to be protective of water quality. The irrigated lands program, as Adam mentioned, is also working in that same issue, which is the MPEP, which is the Management Practice Evaluation Program, to look at what are those appropriate rates and how should they be. As Adam mentioned, when the University of California Committee of Experts provided those numbers back in the time when the dairy program was being developed, they did look primarily at the feed crops, corn, and did not look at the 265 or 75 commodities that we have grown in the Central Valley. Certainly a lot of information is being collected as we move forward. There are also some issues that, when you have things like crop failure on a one-year basis, the application rate could be very high because your yields went considerably lower because maybe you had a hail event or a freeze or something that damaged the crop after you'd already applied nutrients. And so looking at that in a little bit longer term, may be appropriate also. So I think we're looking more to these representative monitoring programs, the management practice evaluation programs, to answer the specific questions, but we still felt it was appropriate to include a target that says, these are the kind of things we think in the interim, until we get more definitive answers, that we should be trying to achieve, and lets us know that when the reports come in and we see something higher than this, then perhaps we need to start looking a little bit closer and asking some questions, particularly if this is not due to some unique event.
I would suspect too that in this program we are seeing, it's closer to the dairy program, we're seeing more application of manure, whereas in irrigated lands, for the large part, that's synthetic nitrogen.
That is true, which creates its own set of unique circumstances. And also we want to make sure that, we don't get into a situation where somebody's encouraged to over-apply because they have a lot of this material sitting around. So we certainly look at the amount of available cropland with the amount of waste that we expect to be produced to see that, there's a reasonable rate that it can be applied at an agronomic rate, because that's really our required, and minimize the amount of the nutrients that can leach to groundwater.
And just one more thing, the concept of a target has been discussed a lot in the development of the state board order for the ag program too. So we may see more of that in the future. I hope to get an order this summer, so we'll see.
So Dr. Longley, to make a short answer even longer, I just want to point out again the difference between a dairy and a traditional ag. This is an operation that generates a waste that has to be disposed of. And when they came up with this range of 1.4 to 1.65, we were seeing much higher application rates, and so this was a target to bring them down after that study done by UCD on what could be done and not have a significant impact on the dairy operation as well. So this is what they believed could be achieved at the time. So
Well,
it
I
was real
understand.
appropriate, especially since this was a whole, it's not like a traditional ag where they're growing a crop.
Well, it's different than ILRP, but
Yes.
it has a lot of similarities to the dairy program.
But at this time, we knew they were having much higher application rates, and
Yeah.
so this was done with a special focus on just that crop, that one particular crop they were growing.
But the A over R question came up during the ILRP, which is the reason I asked that question
Right.
initially.
Mhm.
I don't know if I'm satisfied or not. I never am. Go ahead, please.
Any nitrogen that is not taken up by the crop or released to the atmosphere remains in the soil, where, once flushed by rain or irrigation past the root zone of the crop, it will move into groundwater. Protection of groundwater from the impacts of nitrate is a key concern in the Central Valley and in California as a whole. Staff believes retention of the 1.4 ratio as a target helps reduce the overapplication of nitrogen compounds to cropland. The bovine order allows cropland to be covered by the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program, provided the land meets certain criteria. Some commenters felt that the regional board should conduct scoping meetings with ILRP coalition leaders before adopting the bovine order to determine concerns for enrolling bovine operations and identify possible solutions for those concerns. Staff has discussed these concerns with ILRP coalitions. Based on those discussions, staff believe that there is a common understanding that ILRP membership is not required of bovine operations, and that the order places no requirements on ILRP coalitions. A new finding 47 has been added to specify that enrollment in the ILRP is one option for bovine operations to comply with some of the bovine order requirements, but enrollment is not required. Staff does not believe that a delay in the adoption of the order is necessary. Several commenters requested changes to the order's requirements for testing of soil, plant tissue, manure, and wastewater. While one commenter supported the requirement for testing of cropland for nitrogen, another felt the frequency of soil nitrogen testing should be reduced because it was an expensive test that provided comparatively little data. Another commenter felt that the requirements for plant tissue sampling and analysis should be removed from the order in favor of university or industry standard nitrogen contents of crops or book values. Several commenters felt the testing of wastewater and solid manure should be reduced or discontinued after sufficient samples have been collected to establish a baseline. Knowing the amount of nutrients already in the soil is useful information when determining the amount of additional nutrients that should be applied to grow a specific crop. These soil tests are reasonably inexpensive, about $25 per sample, and provide useful information. The annual soil test is for only one analytical component, total nitrogen. The soil testing requirement has been retained. The regional board recognizes that field samples of crops harvested represent only a small part of the total amount harvested. However, if a plant tissue sample is collected and stored carefully and tested within the appropriate time frame, the analytical results are more representative of plant uptake of nitrogen in that field than our valley-wide data or data from other states. Due to the variability of nitrogen in manure and wastewater and in farming methods, the requirement for site-specific plant tissue analysis has been retained in the order. Many bovine facilities collect corral runoff in a pond and allow it to evaporate. After review of the comments received, staff has changed the requirement to sample the corral runoff in such ponds to a one-time event. This one-time sampling is sufficient to allow characterization of the wastewater in such ponds. The representative monitoring program will also conduct sampling of such ponds and determine the risk such evaporation ponds pose to water quality. For all other monitoring requirements, the order already contains a protocol for requesting changes in sampling frequency and constituents if sufficient justification to support the change is provided. Therefore, no additional changes were made to the order. Several commenters requested either a streamlined approval process for wastewater pond liner designs, a pre-approved single liner pond design, or both. One commenter proposed a single liner pond design for inclusion in the order. Currently, the order has a streamlined approval process for a double liner pond design. The bovine order also allows the proposal of a single liner design that can be pre-approved by the executive officer for use under certain site conditions with minimal additional effort on the part of the discharger. This option is termed a pre-approved Tier 2 design. After review of the commenter's proposed single liner design, staff concludes that the design, by itself and without consideration of site conditions, such as depth to groundwater, would not be protective of groundwater under all site conditions, and therefore would not qualify for region-wide use without additional site-specific evaluations and modifications. While no change has been made to the language in the tentative order regarding the specific liner design requirements, language allowing entities other than the representative monitoring programs to proposed pre-approved Tier 2 liner designs has been added to the order. One commenter was concerned that the order did not clearly specify when wastewater ponds would need to be upgraded or replaced to protect groundwater. The commenter also questioned whether the limited time and limited population operations would have to upgrade their ponds on a similar time schedule as full general order coverage operations. The order allows time for the implementation of the requirements of the order and includes monitoring requirements to evaluate the impacts of existing ponds on groundwater. However, the order also specifies that dischargers may be required to make changes in their management practices, including their pond designs, sooner than the schedules in the order if data from this or other monitoring programs identify practices that are not protective of groundwater quality. The executive officer has the discretion to require limited time or limited population operations to line or otherwise upgrade ponds anytime data indicate that the operation poses a greater threat to water quality than what is consistent with the limited time or limited population tiers. Otherwise, information gathered by the representative monitoring program will be applied to these lower threat tiers as applicable to protect water quality. Finally, commenters felt the bovine order should incorporate the recommendations for best management practices of the salt and nutrient management plan developed as part of the CV salts process. While the board has accepted the best management practices recommendations for consideration, the recommendations have not yet been adopted by the board, so incorporating the recommendations into this order is premature. However, additional language has been added to finding 45 of the order to describe provisions that might be added to the bovine order if it is reopened to incorporate strategies for addressing salt and nitrate accumulation in the Central Valley. Late revisions to the bovine order have been made in 5 areas. Copies of the 2 late revision documents have been sent to you electronically. The late revisions have also been posted on our website, and copies are available on the table outside the boardroom. The first late revision document described the 3 changes on this slide. An inconsistency between the order and monitoring and reporting program regarding the dates that annual reports are due was identified, and the order text and Table 1 were changed. The definition of agricultural composting on page 27 of the order has been revised to make the definition consistent with the definition of agricultural composting in the Composting General Order by removing the statement that agricultural composting excludes manure. Finally, as discussed earlier in the presentation, a new finding 47 has been added to elaborate on the relationship between confined bovine feeding operations and the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. The new finding, which has been reviewed by and discussed with ILRP Coalition members, makes it clear that the bovine order places no additional requirements on ILRP coalitions, and that any cooperation between bovine operations and the ILRP coalitions to perform monitoring would be by mutual agreement between the two parties. The second late revision documents includes the two changes on this slide. Staff has extended the deadlines for some reports. The extensions will be described in the following slide. Changes were also made to the response to comments document to describe the extensions to the deadlines in the order, and to state that staff will be pursuing funding to develop forms for use by bovine operations in complying with the order. The most important changes in the second late revisions document were extensions of deadline in the order. This slide summarizes the most important deadlines in Table 1 and the amount of additional time allowed for compliance, if any. At the top of the chart is the due date for the submittal of the Notice of Intent, or NOI. The NOI will help determine which of the 3 tiers is appropriate for a bovine operation. No change has been made to this deadline. At the bottom of the chart is the deadline for submittal of the summary report for groundwater monitoring. The summary report will identify management practices that are not protective of water quality and which need to be modified at bovine operations. No change has been made to this deadline. In between the due date for the NOI and for the summary report are deadlines for submittal of a series of important documents, and these are the deadlines that have been extended. The most complex tasks are completion of a waste management plan, which must be done by an engineer, and implementation of a nutrient management plan, which may require physical changes to wastewater distribution systems for cropland. Both of these due dates have been extended by 18 months. The due date for the first annual report has been extended by 1 year. Bovine operations are not expected to commence monitoring and sampling until they receive a notice of applicability from the board, which may be several months after they submit the notice of intent in mid-2018. With the extension shown on this slide, the first annual report is now due 1 July 2020 and should contain a full 12 months of data from calendar year 2019. The work plan for well installation has been extended by 1 year to July 2020. Until a representative monitoring program knows which operations will join its program, the RMP is unable to select representative operations for monitoring well installation. The original schedule required submittal of the work plan 6 months after the RMP was formed, which allowed little time for bovine operations to join the RMP and for the RMP to decide on suitable monitoring locations. Under the new schedule, bovine operations must notify the board of their intent to either join an RMP or install their own wells by July 2019. The RMP then has 1 year from that date until July 2020 for selection of appropriate well sites and preparation and submittal of a work plan for well installation. The proposed bovine order is included in your agenda package. I would like to submit this presentation, the agenda package, and files into the record. This concludes our presentation, and we're available to answer any questions.
I was glad to see you add those timelines, change those timelines, given this order's new on this particular group of people, and just in a related instance that I've noted is saw a questionnaire that was sent out on Sigma to a group of folks in the valley, and they confused the regional board with the state board. Point being is that a lot of people don't follow our activities or know who we are that well unless they're dealing with us directly now, like ILRP and the dairies, of course. So it's a new group of people. I think it's going to take a while to get them up to speed. The outreach efforts to them I'm interested in that it's going to require a lot of outreach. And who is going to do that outreach?
We're planning to work with the industry representatives, industry organizations, the Cattlemen's Association. We've talked to some of the dairy industries. A lot of feedlots are part of and provide feedstock to dairies, and so they have an interest in
The dairy ones, some of them certainly, the heifer operations, some of them are familiar with the dairy order, and they may be in it if they
Right,
operate a dairy
former-
also.
former
yeah.
dairies.
But it's the others that are my greatest concern.
We have also been talking with the California Department of Food and Agriculture, and we're hoping to get some assistance working with them as we identify facilities and try to figure out appropriate requirements.
Excuse me,
Yeah,
for the record, Doug Pattison, supervising engineer at the Central Valley Water Board's Fresno office.
Thank you, Doug. I've known you so long. I don't think of you having to introduce yourself. I'm sorry. I should have asked you. Doug's a Fresno State grad. So. But the Food and Ag, the California Department of Food and Agriculture, I'd like to see some efforts on our part to, if we can get them more involved in the education where they think it's appropriate, or where we can convince them it's appropriate, because,
Definitely. And we've talked to them too.
okay.
Their dairy folks have been very helpful. I don't believe they have a separate subset for bovine operations, but their dairy folks have been working with us on this case.
Okay, good. Any further questions or comments? Thank you very much. That was a long presentation. We got started after lunch. I think we'll take a short break, 5 minutes, and we come back. And that'll give the bovine panel. We have next up is the bovine panel. And if you guys could come up front and get organized, we'll be back here in about 5-6 minutes and start the come back out of recess. If we can take our seats, please, and we'll come back into session. By the way, if you Okay, we're back in session, and we have the Bovine Panel, and I see that JP's going to lead off here.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We appreciate the opportunity today to provide our comments in an organized fashion. It's going to be myself, Till Angerman, who is with the he's with Ludorf and Scalmanini Consulting Engineers. He's here today because he also runs the Dairy Representative Monitoring Program as the technical program manager. I work for Dairy Cares and also for that program as their administrator. We've got Bob Moser from Agro Professionals, who is here representing California Cattlemen's Association, is going to make some technical comments, and Paul Souza with Western United Dairymen is going to talk a little bit about the economics of the industry right now. So just very quickly, you've heard from us before. I just want to emphasize that Dairy Cares is representing all the groups that you've heard of in the dairy industry. It's a coalition of all those groups, not a group itself. And it also includes the large milk processors. So we've been working together for a long time and with you for a long time to address some of these sustainability issues related to California's dairy industry. I want to really, we always say thank you to the staff, I think, when we're here. I think I want to put a little extra emphasis on it this time. This has been an extremely difficult process to iron out. There's a lot of issues. It's a complicated and mostly unknown sector. I myself had to go out and learn quite a bit because, I'm not familiar with a lot of the operations that we're regulating. And there aren't organized, there's no one group that represents all of these folks. Some of them aren't represented by anybody. And so we had to do a lot of learning, a lot of talking, and the staff was willing to do that in a very organized and strategic way. They worked with us for 16 months with many meetings focused on specific topics. And we did our part too. We brought together hydrogeologists, engineers, agronomists, so we could have very targeted discussions on specific topics and get those things worked out in advance. And the main thing was to just make sure that all the information we had about those topics was packaged and delivered to the water board so the staff could make the decision about how to write the order. And so, we think that was a very helpful process to us because we get a better order out of it. And we want to pat ourselves a little bit on the back for helping out the staff as well. But everybody worked very hard on this, and I appreciate it. Moving on here. We also, in that process, were able to learn from some things. Now, this has been an interesting process because there's some things where our previous knowledge actually works against us, and there's other things where it helps us. And so we had to figure out what those were, what the important differences were, and address those. One thing that I especially am appreciative of, we asked for early on in this process and learned from the lesson of the dairy order 10 years ago that there was no economic analysis done early in the process. So we were talking about things for almost a year before anybody understood what it cost. And so we asked for and received a very good economic analysis from the staff. A lot of effort went into that. We appreciate that. That was a big difference from before. And that economic analysis is so important because it steers what kind of timelines you need. If you don't know how much something costs, you have no idea how much time you should give folks to implement it. And so by having that information, we were able to provide good input, and I think the board and the staff will be able to make good decisions about the timelines as a result. We've learned a lot about the technical issues.
Jay,
Yes, sir.
before we go further, so any comments? Do you have any comments on the timelines now as they've been amended?
Yes, we think that these timelines are what was needed. This was the last important change that needed to be made to recognize the amount of time that each of these steps would take, and we're in support of the timelines as they stand now.
Thank you.
We appreciate that those changes have been made. The dairy, the technical experience of the dairy monitoring program. Now, we've invested millions and millions of dollars. You've heard about the work that we've done on it, especially the board members who've been here for a while. I know I appreciate that Ms. Kadara, for example, has come to several of our dairy monitoring technical presentations. We have a lot of information that's helped us understand better what we're dealing with, and we were able to bring that into this process. I'm very pleased that Till was part of our working groups that helped steer that, and we've had a lot of data to help make decisions. And so, you know, the result is you got a better order, and we have a much better chance of getting a successful implementation. And that's something we've come to expect. You know, with the dairy industry, we had a very high compliance rate when the order was implemented because we were organized, we worked together on outreach and making sure that we had the tools we needed to get things done. We wanted that this time, and I think we it was a little scary because we went almost down to the finish line with it, but we now feel a pretty higher level of confidence that the board is ready to work with us to get that job done, and we're ready to do our part. And as I said, this is a little bit the reasons why, but you've heard some of this today, but just to really emphasize why these timeline changes were needed. You've got huge variability in size of these operations. And their relative sophistication, everything from, you know, very sophisticated large cattle operations with in-house environmental managers down to folks who don't know the difference between the state water board and the regional water board and maybe have never heard of you before. And so that's important that we understand that. One thing that I'm very proud of in the dairy industry, and which we don't have for this unregulated group, is that dairy quality assurance program. When the dairy order was adopted, we had a 10-year-old program for education and outreach to dairy producers, so they knew what they were doing. They'd just been battle tested for 2 years in the field, educating the San Joaquin dairies about the new air rules. So they were ready to go. I mean, it was still a lot of work, but they were up and running, ready to go. We don't have that today. That doesn't mean we're not ready to attack the problem. It just means we need a little more setup time. We've got to figure out somehow to pull the Cattlemen's Association together with the monitoring program, Dairy Cares, and the Dairy Quality Assurance Program and work out how we're going to do the outreach that needs to happen here and the monitoring program that needs to happen here. We're confident we can do it, and we're more confident today because now we think we have a reasonable amount of time to actually pull that off. And really, I think that's all I have to say. So, let's see.
Well, the quality assurance, dairy quality assurance program, is my understanding that came into being because marketing by some of the dairies is out of state, out of country, and some of the folks, other countries in particular, receiving product have very strong programs. And so there's a real incentive, and it becomes an economic necessity for that program.
Yeah.
It would be nice, and I don't know if it's possible or not, if we could make those kinds of connections also with this program, certainly with where meat production is involved.
Absolutely. The values start there. We want to be able to talk to our stakeholders. That's our consumers, our neighbors, and the people of California in general about what it is we're doing to attack those important issues that are important to them, whether it's food safety
Right.
or environment. You know, those kinds of issues are very important, and you have to have some science-based organized education program to do that. That was in place, and we were able to, as the regulations came online, to launch off that platform. So, all right, I'm going to step aside. And Till's going to talk to you about some other. I'm J.P. Cataviella, first person on that first slide.
Good afternoon. My name is Till Angerman. I am with Ludorf and Scalmanini Consulting Engineers. I'm also the technical program manager for the Central Valley Dairy Representative Monitoring Program. And yes, I took the oath. So I will be covering this slide and the next slide, both of which have a lot of text on them, but I will walk you through them slowly. And to remember is that the headline is really what conveys the message that we want to implant into people who are watching us today. So the application removal ratio came up today already. This slide is about this application removal ratio. We think that it remains inappropriate as a regulated numerical value, and we think that it's based on a misunderstanding or oversimplification of University of California recommendations. A report was cited earlier today where that ratio is coming from. Firstly, we do appreciate very much that the seemingly softened emphasis on the AR ratio of 1.4. I say seemingly because it's actually not so quite clear to me, because in the MRP, it still treats this numerical value as a very special threshold, and it implies that an exceedance of this threshold is not acceptable. So let's go to the UC report, and for your benefit, I have on this slide two cited, or two quotes out of the report that I think are very important. The first one goes that nitrogen input requirements for forage crops will generally be in the range of 140% to 165% of the crop nitrogen harvest removal, assuming that the manure application would consist of lagoon water, which is approximately 75% ammoniacal nitrogen. So there are three very important things in here. Firstly, the researchers of this report, the authors of this report, recognize that there's a general ratio, not a fixed number, and certainly not just the 1.4. That is the lower bound of the general range that they identified. Second, that it is under the assumption that the application would consist of lagoon water. On many dairies, that is the case, but also in addition, solid manures applied. And thirdly, that there's an assumption that the lagoon water will consist of 75% ammoniacal nitrogen, which is often not the case. We've seen ratios of 50%, as low as 50%, the rest of it being in the organic form, which makes it much more difficult to project how plants will be able to take that nitrogen up.
The particular type of operations that we're talking about here certainly don't have the volume of lagoon water, if they have lagoon water at all. Aren't we talking mostly about scrape operations?
That is an entirely very good, yes. So you're pointing out something else, which is that the bovine order doesn't have lagoons like dairies have. They do not maintain a lagoon full of flush water. They have ponds that have surface water runoff from precipitation events in there. But it still includes language that was essentially taken out of the dairy order, imported here, and then slightly changed. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, but that's subject to a lot more discussion down the road. Go ahead.
I
maybe
agree.
Maybe not even today. I don't know. Go ahead.
Yeah. The second quote, I'm not going to read you the entire thing, but it's the important point there is that the authors recognized that this general range is plausible in principle, but may be problematic when implemented on full-scale production systems. Basically, they're pointing to the difference between a team of researchers doing work on a few fields versus a farmer who's running an operation with dozens of fields potentially, doing good nutrient management on an entire farm. So in summary, I think, well, we're saying that as the bovine order stands right now, we think that it disregards, firstly, significant uncertainties in measurement. It disregards UC's stated assumptions and UC's cautionary notes. And I also want to point out that the bovine order is not consistent with the irrigated lands regulatory program orders, which today do not set specific AR ratio for any crop. Second slide is about single-lined lagoons. Without being very technical here at all, our basic thought is that we think that the bovine order should make it easier for people to install ponds with a single synthetic liner. It should be easy to do that, not hard. So the bovine order right now makes it equally difficult to obtain approval for the construction of a pond with a single synthetic liner or single synthetic membrane and construction of an earthen pond. There is a provision for a pre-approved Tier 2 pond in the order. We looked at that very carefully and discussed it, and it really doesn't help at all. It just puts the burden on a representative monitoring program rather than an individual, but the difficulty of the task is still there. The bovine order does streamline the approval for double synthetically lined ponds, and they do that with a finding of consistency with the 68-16. So we have been dealing with that under the dairy order, which was adopted in 2007, and the bullet points show you what we found. And nobody builds earthen ponds anymore. Nobody builds ponds with single synthetic membranes anymore. And very few farmers can cough up the money to build double synthetically lined ponds.
So what do they do?
Yeah, they talk to the engineer. A lot of them are in holding patterns. They would like to expand. They would like to do something, but they're not doing it. So a lot of it is waiting for something to happen so that they can actually build. So we think that streamlined adoption of ponds with single synthetic membranes will encourage and incentivize wider use, leading to reduced seepage from ponds and faster improvement in this area of the dairy manure management. Thank you.
Being somewhat familiar with synthetic membranes in ponds, I know they can leak like a sieve. Typically, these ponds are constructed, well, these facilities tend to be constructed in areas with good drainage, meaning over lighter soils. And so they become, quite frankly, a direct conduit to the groundwater. And that's a great concern to me. And that kind of goes back to your previous slide. My comment on that, quite frankly, is that there has been a great change in the dairy industry on the care that people give when they're using manure on crops. And I know that one individual I know complained to me bitterly about how we were regulating them. And he later praised what we were doing, saying that he didn't realize they could get the same production with a lot less fertilizer, manure on the crop. And in fact, they're able to farm more acreage now with the fertilizer they're generating. It gets back to practices and best management practices. And I can't really agree with your first slide in many of the comments or the conclusions that you drew from that first slide. I think that we can get there if we have good management practices. What it means that we have to watch our irrigation carefully. We have to, where we're using drip, we have to maintain it. If we're not using drip, but a lot of people put drip in and walk away from it, and they shoot themselves in the foot when they do that because they under irrigate some trees or crop, and they over irrigate another part of their crop. When you're doing trees, certainly when you're doing forage crops, it's different. Typically, you're using row or flood irrigation, and there, there's best management practices there. You don't want a mile run on your rows or whatever. You want shorter runs. You want to level as closely as you can. Now you get better water management. You save water, and you save nutrients. I just really think that this is pointing everybody to do the best job they can, and it's interesting. The big operators are the ones that tend to be much better at doing this because they realize it saves money and that it's good for their bottom line. So I can't really thoroughly agree with the conclusions that you're drawing from this, nor from the following slide, but that's my opinion. I don't know how the other board members feel.
Well, if you give me just 15 seconds, I agree with everything that you've said. I don't really understand where you disagree with me. Is it just the conclusion that the bovine order is not consistent with the irrigated lands order, or the bovine order?
No, I know it's not consistent. Maybe I misunderstood you, and I did. I'm sorry.
Well, for the record, everything you just said, I agree with the exception that you disagree with me because I'm not quite sure what you're disagreeing
okay.
on.
Well, then I apologize for that.
That's okay.
Thank you. My name is Bob Mosier, and in the interest of time, I'm going to have to get cracking here, but I'm with Ag Professionals out of Greeley, Colorado. We're a agricultural consulting firm that have dealt in environmental compliance for dairies and feedlots for over 20 years, and I'm happy to be here to represent the California Cattlemen's Association. Thank you very much, the staff and the board, for extending those timelines. I think they're very important to ease the impact of some capital expenditures out there on some of those operations, as well as giving us time for outreach to reach the producers out there, advise them to what they're going to come under, and try to get compliance within those timelines. So thank you again for that. Secondly, we're not dairies. And I think might have been mentioned earlier, we do not have processed wastewater. It can be from anywhere to 10 to 20 gallons per head per day generated by a dairy operation versus a feedlot operation from beef cattle. We're only dealing with a storm event and that runoff. And of course, we're going to have variations in the Central Valley from Bakersfield, which only has about 1.7 inches in a 24-hour, 25-year storm event, to maybe up north, where it's going to be upwards of 4 to 5 inches in that event. So it's going to be some site-specific considerations, which we hope staff will take that into consideration when we're looking at these ponds, because some of them are actually never discharged, and they're going to be merely evaporative ponds. Lastly, I would like to comment on, I think it'd be very important that we look at, because there's not enough concentration of feedlots, that those feedlots, calf ranches, so forth, can join an existing dairy RMP for the representative monitoring report. I think that'll be very important, and it'll help the impact as far as groundwater monitoring. So I would encourage you to consider us being able to join the dairy order in that regard, as it's applicable for the RMP. So hopefully you'll consider that. I think it'd be very important.
Well, and staff can correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand the change to the order, proposed amendment to the order, is that it gives you the opportunity to establish an MOU with folks in the dairy program insofar as representative monitoring is concerned. So that should address that concern, I would hope.
Oh, well, thank you very much. We didn't get all of the late notice on our deal, but thank you again for that.
Can I ask a question? Can you explain your term evaporative pond and discharge? 'Cause to us, discharge also means percolation. I was just curious.
Well, we're going to have to seal the pond, whether it's evaporative or not. But evaporative means it's not going to be land applied. It's going to merely evaporate because of lack of rainfall or water going into that pond, because they only have to manage a storm event, not process wastewater versus a dairy. Plus, you have dry manure. These are all open lots for the not housed units. So you're going to have a dry manure base to start with. Much of that manure is going to be composted and gone, because we're You know, a lot of these concentrated feeding operations do not have farming operations per se. We import, you know, a lot of the grains and so forth.
Okay.
So it's going to be very important, I think, to be sensitive, be site-specific, because, you know, there's great variations in sizes of the operations as well as, you know, their management practice.
What you're pointing out is there's great differences between your type of operations and the dairies, and certainly you're not farmers in the sense that the farm operations that we regulate. Am I correct?
Yes, sir. Because a lot of this order was, you know, started out is pretty much, you know, using the dairy order as a formation,
Right.
but I always like to, you know, just identify those operational differences.
I'm sorry, I just noticed the time was running. I think he was answering questions from us, so I don't know if that's 1 minute or 2 minutes more, but. Okay.
All right, thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're out of time. Go ahead, talk.
So this order will have some impact on
Introduce
dairies.
yourself, Paul.
Paul Souza with Western United Dairymen, and I have taken the oath.
Thank you.
I do welcome the economic analysis, as JP had mentioned. For the dairy order, the dairy industry conducted that analysis, and then it got incorporated into the dairy order, and so I do welcome the board doing that. I think if you look at it, there's some very big numbers and some very big costs that concern us. Western United Dairymen submitted comments on the economic impact, as dairy will be affected by this. Dairy is currently in an economically fragile state, and I think there will be other commenters that will elaborate more on that. This is due to economic and other regulatory burdens that dairy is facing right now in California. Some dairies have their replacements raised by third-party calf or heifer ranches, and in our comment letter, we estimate that about 49% of the animals actually at some point are at a third-party raiser that will be affected by this. And those costs borne by those third-party facilities will be passed on to dairy facilities. I appreciate the clarifying language that heifers covered by the dairy WDR will not be covered under this order. That it doesn't make sense for a dairy operator who's covered, you know, have multiple permits for his one operation, and I think Charlene did a good job of discussing that. But there are things that you can do as far as the costs to help control the costs. Costs are best addressed with a reasonable time limit or timeline that helps operators and the water board achieve success, as the current timeline currently states in the late amendments. Setting an unachievable timeline only sets up our operators, the water board, and water quality for failure. This, as we've heard today, this is a newly regulated group that needs time to understand the regulations and how to comply with them. And it's going to take time to develop an outreach and education program to be successful. And this timeline helps us do that. I want to back up what Chairman Longley was saying earlier about providing standard forms. I think it's important. They lower the cost of not having to develop these individually. And I think importantly for the board also, as Chair Longley was pointing out, it benefits the board in getting consistent reports that you can look from one facility to the next and know what you're looking at, not have to scratch your head and trying to figure out, you know, what is this facility because it's coming in on a different report. I think it's also important to have flexibility in the approach moving forward. This is just a starting point today. This is not the end of the game. This is where we start from, and we're going to need flexibility as we implement this and run across unforeseen circumstances. And I would hope that the staff has that, feels that discretion to do that and allow flexibility in how this is implemented. And thank you for your time.
Any questions, members of the board, for any member of the panel? I want to thank you very much for your presentations, and we look forward to working with you. I have a card from Miss Orrs, Community Water Center. Is that Debbie Orrs?
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you. So I also want to clarify, we were not informed that we could even do a presentation until we were given the possibility that we might be able to Tuesday afternoon, and we're told that we could do a presentation about 5 minutes before this started.
I got notified that asked if the previous group could do one on Tuesday, and I guess that's when they put the request in. So I told them to talk to you guys, and that's why you got the notice then. So it was a last minute thing.
Yeah. So if I can have a few extra minutes for a comment.
Oh gosh, yes.
Thank you. My name's Debbie Orrs. I'm an attorney with Community Water Center. My comments are also on behalf of Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, with whom we did joint comments on this letter, and have been working with staff for several months now, on this order. I just want to start off by thanking staff and the board for doing this order, because we've been asking for a while to regulate additional CAFOs since we've been working on the dairy order about 9 years ago. So it's really important to have this, even though bovine feedlots and poultry, which you adopted back in December, have a reduced or a less impact than dairies do, they do still have an impact on groundwater contamination. And nitrates are an acute contaminant that causes a public health hazard to communities who are living nearby and dependent upon groundwater for their drinking water supply. We also, I'm going to start with the things that we appreciate. We strongly support the 1.4 target. We understand that there are some limitations to it, but I think it is something, as you pointed out, Dr. Longley, that we need to be able to have something that we are striving towards achieving, something to, a goal to go towards in order to protect groundwater quality. We also appreciate the connection to the Dairy Representative Monitoring Program within this bovine feedlots. There's no, doing a individual and representative monitoring program within this is also great, but if the Dairy Representative Monitoring Program comes up with conclusions that can be applied to bovine, why should we bother duplicating efforts? So we do appreciate that. We also appreciate the inclusion of flow meters and the inclusion of the composting, connection to the composting order. And we also appreciate the later amendments to try and prevent splintering of facilities to prevent full coverage coverage under the full operations. This is something that the Central Coast is seeing with their irrigated lands regulatory program. Farms are splintering a little bit to avoid the highest tier and avoid that highest regulatory burden. So we didn't want to see that happen here with bovine feedlots. So moving on to some of the concerns we have, we do think that there's still issues with this order that will not be protective of groundwater. First, for anti-degradation policy, we do acknowledge that the anti-deg policy was, or analysis was amended to be a bit more robust. However, the max benefit analysis does not consider the economic and social impacts to communities who are dealing with nitrate contamination. It is a max benefit looking at the industry, which is definitely important, but you also do need to consider what is communities dealing with and what is their costs when dealing with contamination. The anti-deg policy also looks at whether or not this will be an impact to long-term beneficial uses. But as I mentioned earlier, nitrates are an acute contaminant. They cause problems now and in the short term. So looking at saying in 20 years this is not going to cause a problem does not help people now. Also dealing with ponds. The order acknowledges that the mini ponds are not BPTC and that the old standards are no longer considered BPTC, and allowing these ponds to continue operating and being used when we know that they are not BPTC, and as you pointed out, some of them do leak quite a lot. And even the initial reports coming out of the Dairy Representative Monitoring Program are showing that there is some seepage in certain conditions.
I think you have to consider, though, that these ponds are quite different than what we would see for a dairy, and the threat, therefore, is different.
Oh.
And while I concur that, I'm always concerned with ponds leaking, we really don't have a good handle. Maybe we do. I'm not aware of the nitrogen levels that you would typically see in these ponds, and I think that's part of what has to be developed as we go down the road. I share your concern, but I don't think the threat level's the same.
It's not the same as in dairies, but it is something that we are starting to see. We are seeing a little bit with the Dairy Representative Monitoring Program, and it is something we'll probably have to look at on a case-by-case basis. But having some sort of plan of action for how to be phasing out ponds that are leaking is something that needs to be considered and needs to be incorporated. Moving on, the limited population, my only concern is that we don't understand what is the scope and of how many of these operations are out there, and they are subject to a much reduced regulatory burden. This may not be a big deal if there's only a few of them out there, but we don't know. So something that as the NOIs are coming in, I think that's something that we should be considering, or you should be considering something that maybe you open it back up if it seems like they are actually a quite prevalent operation. Next, there's the issue of as soon as practical. We understand staff's concerns that what is going to be as soon as practical is going to be different for each operation and each situation. However, it requires that you look at the economic and technical considerations, but again, this does not consider the economic cost to communities nearby. So that also needs to be considered again. And finally, in my last minute, we went into extensive detail about how we felt the timelines in the first draft were not sufficient and that they were too long, and of course now they've been extended even further. Many of these, just even doing an operation and maintenance plan, you can look at your at what you're doing on property, and this could lead to changes, but we are now extending this out even further than it currently was already required. We need to be doing something to prevent seepage, and extending all these timelines is really not sufficient for protecting groundwater. And if you look at all of the timelines, it was already about 20 years until you can see significant changes, and we've just extended it by 12 to 18 months. So with that, if you have any questions.
Are there questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Rachel O'Brien, and then Denise Mullinex.
Good afternoon. Chair and members of the board, Rachel O'Brien with the Agricultural Council of California. Ag Council is a member-supported organization advocating for more than 15,000 farmers across California, ranging from small farmer-owned businesses to some of the world's best-known brands. On the dairy side, Ag Council represents 3 dairy cooperatives,
And you've taken the oath.
I have taken the oath.
Thank you.
3 dairy cooperatives, Land O'Lakes, California Dairies Incorporated, and Dairy Farmers of America. Enhancing the tentative waste discharge requirements general order for the confined bovine feeding operations, enhancing their ability to protect water quality while moving towards a more reasonable and practical expectation for the regulated community is our main objective. I would like to associate my comments with the industry presentation you heard earlier. I'd also like to thank staff for working with stakeholders on concerns around compliance timelines and forums. Even with the adjusted schedule, we still have a tough job ahead. A flexible approach is needed going forward, as is a partnership between the board and industry. This will help to establish a more successful and collaborative regulatory approach. I'd just like to close with saying that Ag Council supports the late revisions, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Denise? Next will be Catherine Machado.
Good afternoon, Chair Longley and members of the board. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Denise Molinax, and I'm with the California Dairy Quality Assurance Program and the California Dairy Research Foundation, and yes, I have taken the oath. Just as a reminder, C2QAP is a collaborative partnership between the dairy industry, the University of California, and multiple of the environmental and state agencies within California. We're going on 20 years next year. And our program has the unified goal of science-based education, support, and third-party certification for the California dairy industry. I come before you this afternoon to speak really to two issues. The first one is to support this expanded timeline for compliance that's now included. I think staff was very wise in doing that. As you may be familiar or was touched on earlier, CDQAP led the outreach efforts for the dairy industry when the dairy general order was adopted. And that was a very successful endeavor, but it, as many have mentioned before, built very strategically upon some establishments within the industry. That program had been around for 10 years, and we had just come off of some very intensive education for our dairy producers. And we had a 5-year implementation period for that general order. The situation is very different with this order, but there are some similarities that have already been recognized, and that we have a group of folks here that very similarly don't have a lot of experience with this regulatory agency or being regulated under water quality regulations. So that extended timeline is really going to be critical, not only to make sure that we can go out and educate those folks, but also for plan development. So I think as most folks recognize, it's not plans that protect water quality, but people that protect water quality. And so it's very important to allow for that time to get that information out there in bite-sized chunks that can be digested, and that those folks take an active role in that, that plan implementation and development out there on farm for those to be successful. Which brings me to my second point. While CDQAP may be a potential part of the education team and are certainly willing at a minimum to be imparting like key learnings from our past educational efforts, this won't be a turnkey effort, okay? Our funding and our program focus is on dairy producers, and obviously this particular general order goes far beyond that in terms of coverage. So it will be a different endeavor, and it will include a whole new outreach team and need funding sources and a whole new effort put into place for that. Obviously, this order has different regulations, and we'll have to create new and special forms for that. And so it's going to be important that we have the time to do that. So I think this extended period of time and the flexibility going forward is really going to be critical. So we stand ready to be part of that team. But it's going to take a whole lot of work in front of us.
Any questions from board members? I want to thank you, first of all, for the great work you've done over the years and the work that your organization's done. It's been critical, certainly, to getting the great advances I think we've seen in the dairy general order. So once again, thanks a lot.
Thank you for that. And we certainly have appreciated all the hard work and the cooperation with your staff. I think it's really gone hand in hand
That's great
to be
to hear.
successful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next card is for Catherine Machado. Following Catherine will be Stacy Sullivan.
Good afternoon, Dr. Longley and members of the board. My name is Catherine Machado, and I have taken the oath. I'm here today representing Milk Producers Council, an association of hundreds of family farmers here in California. Milk Producers Council is a longtime member of the Dairy Cares Coalition, and we support the comments made earlier in their presentation as well. While the issue at hand is important to all of our members, as dairy farming is closely intertwined with raising heifers and also is closely tied to the beef industry, this issue is also personal to myself, as I am a third-generation dairy farmer. My family currently owns and operates a dairy farm and a small calf ranch operation in Madera County. Despite all the struggles that the dairy industry has had throughout the years, my family included, I will always say that I am proud to have been able to grow up in an agriculture community, as it is a big part of the person that I am today. Unfortunately, however, it seems as though the struggles have been ever constant and clearly has worn on producers. Too many have chosen to give up their farms in response to the increasing pressures of doing business in California. The economic impact that these regulations have, in conjunction with all of the other operating expenses that we acquire, and along with the milk market's volatility, is quite significant. I include dairies in my discussion because calf ranches and financial advisors that I have spoken with agree that the cost created by this regulation will impact the total cost of raising replacement heifers for dairymen. With the weight of these economic impacts and the work required to fully implement the bovine order, I very much appreciate your staff's efforts to reconsider and extend the compliance timeline, allowing costs to be more manageable. Implementing a bovine order will still be a challenge, but the staging of the requirements will be a great help in allowing us all to work together to achieve compliance and protect our water quality. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think there are some opportunities. I think you recognize also within the heifer operations to be able to benefit by partnering with dairy operations to reduce costs. Are there any questions or comments by members of the board? I want to thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you.
That's the last. Is there anyone else wishing to offer testimony on this item? Seeing none, then we'll take a closing statement by staff. Was there somebody else wishing to testify? You got good eyes. Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give is the truth? If so, answer I do.
I do.
Thank you. And please state your name and affiliation.
My name is Joe Mello. I work for California Dairy Campaign, and I'm on behalf of the dairy family dairy producers members.
Can you get a little closer to the mic?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
On behalf of the family dairy producers, members of California Dairy Campaign, I speak today to raise our concerns about the economic impact of the proposed bovine general order, which will further increase the cost of milk production in our state, milk produced in our state. My name, and I serve as a 5 seconds. Since the beginning of 2017, milk production has been in decline due to the fact that milk prices paid to dairy producers do not come close to the milk production costs. Starting in January 2015, milk production in California declined by more than 20 months. Through August of 2016, production increased modestly, but has been in decline since each month in 2017 compared to the same period in 2016. Last year, according to the California Department of Food and Agriculture, 46 dairies went out of operation across California. We consider the high cost of milk production in California, including the cost to comply with state regulations, to be a major factor in the closure of dairies across the state. It is important to recognize that the California dairy industry supports 189,000 jobs, including 55,000 milk production and processing jobs. Downturn in milk production has and will jeopardize more jobs across the state. Many of the dairy operations that have closed their doors were in operation for generations, creating jobs through the local and state economy. The number of dairies in the state has dropped to 1,392, decrease of more than 330 dairies in the last 5 years. If the bovine general order is adopted as proposed, it will increase the cost of produced milk in California and worsen the already difficult situation facing California dairy families. According to the latest available mailbox prices, California dairy producers receive the third lowest mailbox price, or the net of any other 23 milk producing states. reportedly by the United States Department of Agriculture. California dairy farmers are routinely the lowest paid of any in the nation and have been enduring mounting losses since producers began to decline in late 2014. According to the 2016 CDFA cost of production annual report, the average cost to produce milk in California totaled $17.94 in 2016, while the average income received totaled $15.56, leading to a net loss of $2.38 on average throughout the state. Since the worst year in memory, 2009, when dairy farmers were losing 5.39 per CWT, average dairy operations statewide have only experienced prohibiting during 2 years this year, since prices in 2014 have been fallen below production cost of $3.36 per CWT. In 2015, again, $2.38 per CWT in 2016. Dairy farmers are not able to pass on increased costs. Another increase in the regulatory costs called for in the bovine general order will present an additional challenge for dairies farm families. In conclusion, we speak here today to raise concerns that the proposal bovine order as it currently drafted will further increase the cost to produce milk in California and create an even greater challenge for California dairy families who continue to face a very uncertain future due to the fact that their income does not come close to covering their operating costs. We really appreciate your attention to this regard and look forward to working with you the issues affecting California dairies.
Are there any questions?
No, thank you for making the track and testifying. And I did a quick search to figure out what a mailbox price is. I wasn't familiar with that term, but now I am. So
Okay.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anybody else who wishes to testify on this matter? If you do wish to testify, please stand up so I can see you. Seeing no one, this is the time for closing statement by staff.
Hi, Dr. Longley. Clay Rogers, Assistant Executive Officer in the Fresno office, and I'll take an attempt at the closing statement. First of all, I want to just add a couple things. I mean, there were some concerns presented about the fact that we need to streamline construction of lined ponds over unlined ponds. And certainly we agree with that. We require now that if you're not going to build basically what amounts to a Class 2 surface impoundment for an impoundment, which basically is a double liner with leachate collection and removal system, that you present us a design for a single liner that shows that the leakage is reduced to the point that it's not an unacceptable threat to groundwater quality. We're very open and we've encouraged, standard designs presented to us and what conditions they would be protective of so that we can streamline that even further. We have streamlined the standard design for a double liner because, we get the two liners and the protection is there. It basically meets Title 27, so it's, we don't need to go through the analysis. It certainly is streamlined over construction of an unlined impoundment because it would be very difficult to demonstrate, I believe, perhaps not impossible, but very difficult to demonstrate that an unlined impoundment, except in only very specific conditions, would be protective of the underlying groundwater quality. There were also statements saying that none of these facilities are being built. I will tell you, as the assistant executive officer that has the delegated authority in Fresno to sign the approvals on behalf of the executive officer, I do sign some of these. There is not a large number of them, but we do approve and projects are moving forward with liner projects. So it's not like there's actually none moving forward.
Clay, do we have any idea what the quality of water is in these facilities that would be going
You
into
mean
a
quality
pond?
of water in the pond or
Yeah,
quality
no,
of the underlying groundwater?
In the pond.
Yes, we do. We actually require analyses annually of the water that's in the pond.
But have you been getting it for these kind of operations?
Yes. Yes, it's
And what-
required of, well, it's required of all dairies. So let me back that off a little bit.
Because we're not talking about dairy wash water here.
We are, but we do have some dry scrape dairies also.
Okay.
That all we deal with is stormwater. Now, I'd have to research that and we'd have to get back to you about what the specific requirements are. We certainly would not expect that the salinity and nutrient value would be as high. You know, certainly the volume of water is much less. But I think we do have some information. You know, again, in this, we will collect some information. We don't think we need a whole lot of information. And that goes along with one of the statements I wanted to make in that, you know, we've worked pretty diligently at this to see where we could minimize our requirements to minimize the cost for the implementation of this order. Certainly, it's not inexpensive to implement this, but we felt that, you know, we needed to require only those things that were needed. So like the pond sampling, we decided that in most instances, we can get a one-time sample. When we look at the number of facilities we're gonna have, we think we'll have a pretty good set of what's there. It's also required that if the water is being used for irrigation, which is really where a lot of the dairy stuff comes from, then they do have to sample it much more regularly in order to be able to account for the nutrient value in their nutrient management plans.
So if someone comes into you with a plan for a pond, and we don't have many dairies on the west side, but they're on the west side and over good clay with no underlying groundwater that meets beneficial use criteria, would you accept a pond without a liner in that case?
If we can demonstrate that it can comply with, you know, being protective of the beneficial uses of groundwater, yes, we would consider that, and I could envision it, let's say, something in the middle of the Tulare Lake bed where the beneficial uses have actually been removed.
But where we see most of these is over lighter soils.
Yeah,
without groundwater
unfortunately,
directly underneath.
You know, many of these facilities are on the east side of the valley where we have coarse soils overlying very good quality groundwater. Those really were my comments. You know, we've worked hard to minimize the cost. We understand it's an important one. We will work diligently with the industry in finding ways to help fund outreach, fund new reporting tools so that we can minimize this. And we'll work diligently with the industry to do the outreach we need to find these people, make sure they're informed of what the requirements are, and help to get them educated. With that, I'm sorry, Dr. Longley.
Going to ask, go ahead, make your statement.
I was just going to say with that, you know, we would recommend that the order be adopted with all of the late revisions. And thank you very much.
Any questions for Clay?
I remember this comment about vegetation on banks and the certified organic folks not wanting to be able to grow that, and I can't remember what the comment response was on that. So
We'll have Charlene answer
I'm in
that
the weeds
question.
here a bit,
since-
but nonetheless.
No, that's fine.
No pun
That's great.
intended.
You're getting out there in the grass.
Charlene Herbst. In a case like that, they would be allowed to mow it. Our concern is that we need to be able to see if there's erosion or animal activity, there anything that would compromise the integrity of the embankment. So we told them that they could mow it as long as they mow it short enough so we can see what's going
Got
on.
it, thanks.
Clay, one question, John over here. I know Deborah said that you know, their comment was timelines were too long, and then they became longer. Did we circle back with her and explain why? I just want to make sure we close the loop. I don't need to rehash the whole thing. I just want to make sure that
I will tell you there were a number of these changes, as you've seen in the late revisions, that just happened in the past few days. So we did not have the opportunity in the last couple days to circle back. I'll commit that we will meet with her and explain why we thought the need was, but basically, the reason we decided to take the extended timelines is because we did become convinced that this was going to be a difficult program to implement. We needed to have sufficient timelines that allow us to do this, and I think the industry was correct in their statement that said that we're better off to take just a little bit more time to do it right than to end up with a program that fails because we get overly aggressive on the rate that we want to see it implemented. And that really became the bottom line of why we felt it was appropriate to make those changes, and went ahead and proposed those changes to you and recommend that those be incorporated into the order.
I'd rather it be done now than you showing up at a later date asking for them.
And I, following up with that question, with the EJ group raising the issue of the pond seepage and what happens during that process that we're doing the outreach and education, the seepage is still occurring. Is there any kind of response we can give regarding that?
Well, the best way that I can answer that question is seepage is occurring. I can't argue with that. We put in this order the representative monitoring program, which basically, much like the management practice evaluation program in the irrigated lands order that you'll hear about here in the next item, is really designed to identify those management practices that are protective of water quality and minimize our effects on water quality. The dairy industry is certainly looking very carefully at ponds and working extensively in the representative monitoring program to answer those questions. We did include language in this order that says that if another monitoring program identifies the management practices that need to be implemented, the executive officer has the authority to require that at a sooner date. Along those lines, we've also been supportive of the representative monitoring program working with that is existing for the dairies, working with what we're asking to be done with the feedlots, because we think that is a more efficient, both from timelines, cost-wise, and efforts altogether to do that. But there will be, the leakage will occur in those ponds. We're trying to work as diligently as we can to move forward and address the pond issue. That is part of the reason why you saw the requirement in this order that basically says ponds are not to be constructed into groundwater. That is primarily an issue in the San Joaquin Basin. It's not so much an issue in the Tulare Lake Basin because there's already a basin plan requirement in the Tulare Lake Basin that requires 5 feet of separation between the bottom of an animal waste pond and groundwater. And we have a few dairy ponds that are into groundwater. We're working to get that resolved. And so we felt it was appropriate based upon what we've learned in the dairy program not to have those ponds there. So we are working on that issue diligently and trying to get it, but at the same time, do it in the manner that we do it right. And unfortunately, that takes a little bit of time sometimes.
Thank you, Clay. I was just looking for a balance in how we are responding to all the stakeholders involved in this. Thank you very much.
One last comment.
Go ahead.
Clay admitted that this was a difficult program to implement, and the pyrethroids is a difficult and complicated program to implement. I'm waiting for the easy program to implement.
So are we.
They've already been implemented. At this point, then, I'll take a recommendation from the executive officer.
I'm sorry, Dr. Longley. I agree with Clay.
Thank you.
Recommend
I
adopting the order
suspected
with-
you were
thank
going to say that, being what given what he said previously. I'll close the hearing then and leave deliberation, discussion, and voting to the board. Do we have any discussion? Entertain a motion with the with all the amendments. Raji is preparing to make that motion, or
I motion to approve the, somebody help me, the waste discharge requirements for general order for the bovine feeding operations.
with all late
With
revisions?
all the late revisions.
And John, are you going to second that?
I will, yes.
So it's a motion by Raji, seconded by John. Roll call, please.
Well, I want further
Go ahead.
discussion. I do want to, I mean, this is interesting to me, and yeah, these are getting more difficult in some ways. We're getting to smaller pieces of the puzzle in terms of protecting water quality. We've done irrigated lands program, we've done dairies, we're doing bovine feeding, or we're dealing with poultry operations. And it isn't just on the ag side, there's a lot of other areas where, you know, we're sort of drilling down to ensure that we protect water quality through all of these programs. And I've commented before, and looking at some of the annual reports, I think since I started on the board in about the late 1990s to now, I think we've added we had maybe 8 programs, and now we've got like 18 or 19. And I appreciate that, and the hard work staff does to do that. And we come up against these questions a lot about, you know, time to implement. We come up to questions about cost, and those are hard questions. And, you know, what is a job? I mean, it's not just a job, it's like a family and their sustenance. And so jobs are important, and trying to make these things work the best way we can, I think that's really critical. And I appreciate the hard work that staff's done on this difficult, because it is difficult, general order, and I am going to support it. But, you know, water quality for communities throughout the Central Valley is especially remediation in difficult places and solving water quality for disadvantaged communities. That's our job, and this is part of that. So thank you, everybody, for
Thank you,
the hard
Bob.
work.
And I guess I should point out that it's my observation, and maybe if someone has something to add or correct me, please do, but about the time you came on the board, 98 was when the legislature sunsetted the waivers. And we had a long, long list of waivers. With the sunsetting, that really started us on the journey for, first of all, the dairy order and irrigated lands, as Bob pointed out. And it's been a long journey, and I suspect we're going to see a point in time, not too distant future, when we're not going to be bringing new programs on board with the frequency that we have been bringing them on board for the past almost 2 decades. And it's been an interesting journey, certainly, to be on the board when so many new orders are coming, programs are coming forward. It creates a real responsibility for the board to find something that protects water quality. We can't make it cheap. Oftentimes, we can make it as with good common sense, as cost effective as possible, and I think that's part of our mission also. But protecting water quality is what it's all about. Any further comments?
No, only that, you know, that was sort of tongue in cheek, my joke, but Bob, I appreciate your comment, because it's sort of the truth that belies the comment, that things are difficult, and this is a important and difficult job we're doing, but that's the job we have.
Any further comments? Call the roll, please.
Ms. Brar,
Yes.
Mr. Costantino,
Aye.
Mr. Schneider, Dr. Markham,
Aye.
Ms. Kadara, Dr. Longley.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you very much. Please be back here at 3:45. We'll take a short break. Let's come back into order, please. Did Thomas Harder have to leave? Oh, there he is. He turned around. I didn't recognize him. Sorry about keeping you here so long, Thomas. You got to see a full day of board meetings. So we're back in session on agenda item 8. At this time, the board will hear an update on the Irrigated Land Programs Management Practices Evaluation Program. This is an information item only, and no action will be taken, although the board may ask questions and provide direction to staff. After the staff presentation, there will be presentations by representatives of the Southern San Joaquin Water Quality Coalition, David Corey, Dr. Thomas Harder, and then other interested persons will be allowed 3 minutes each to address the board. We'll now hear the staff presentation.
Good afternoon, Dr. Longley, members of the board. I'm Sue McConnell, the Irrigated Lands Program Manager, and I'm here to introduce the Management Practices Evaluation Program information item. So, I'll start with a brief overview of the Irrigated Lands groundwater protection effort. Explain the importance of the Management Practices Evaluation Program, also known as the MPEP or MPEP. Describe the objectives and the expectations for the MPEP, and then turn it over to the Southern San Joaquin Valley MPEP Committee to describe their work plan. So the Irrigated Lands groundwater protection effort is made up of the following elements. More details about them and how they're connected will be provided in the next slide. All coalitions have approved groundwater assessment reports, or GARs, which have identified high vulnerability areas where groundwater has either already been impacted or is vulnerable to impact. So this figure on the right shows the groundwater high vulnerability areas in our region, colored in brown. Each grower in the program is required to develop site-specific farm plans, including a farm evaluation and a nitrogen management plan. Each coalition is required to have a groundwater quality management plan, or GQMP. Coalitions are working together to develop an MPEP, which you'll hear more about today. And then finally, all the coalitions are required to have groundwater trend monitoring. This graphic shows how these elements work together to protect groundwater quality. The purple shows coalition information gathering and reporting. The yellow shows grower actions. The rectangular elements gather and analyze information to guide the star-shaped action elements. As I mentioned, the GAR identifies the groundwater high vulnerability areas to be addressed by the MPEP and groundwater quality management plan. The MPEP, or Management Practices Evaluation Program, identifies protective practices and estimates the impact of grower practices on groundwater. The Groundwater Quality Management Plan provides tools for implementing protective practices identified in the waste discharge requirements and the Management Practices Evaluation Program. The farm plans document the grower practices and the nitrogen application information. There is an annual report submitted by each coalition that provides grower and monitoring data, the completed and upcoming work. It also includes progress reports from the MPEP and the Groundwater Quality Management Plan. And you'll note that most of the groundwater protection efforts have an annual reporting requirement. And then finally, the groundwater quality trend monitoring determines the groundwater trends influenced by grower implementation of practices. So the irrigated lands general orders include objectives for the MPEP, and those objectives are to identify whether existing management practices are protective of groundwater quality, determine if new management practices would improve groundwater quality, estimate the effect the members' discharges have on groundwater quality using either a mass balance or conceptual model, and finally determine if practices implemented at representative or represented member farms need to be improved. Since the MPEP is a key groundwater protection element, it's important to lay out our expectations. In terms of timeframes, we expect identification of practices that minimize leaching of constituents of concern to occur using currently available information, with the ultimate goal of the MPEP being the identification of protective practices to achieve receiving water limitations. And I should mention that under CV salts, we are working on a planning effort to allow agricultural discharges of salt and nitrates to continue, even if conditions make immediate implementation of protective practices for those constituents infeasible. So the proposed alternative compliance option would allow continuation of agricultural discharges of salt and nitrates if growers implement BPTC, or best practicable treatment control, or best efforts, if there's protection of the groundwater users, and if there's long-term development of protective practices and restoration if reasonable and feasible. So the South San Joaquin Valley MPEP work plan was submitted significantly ahead of its due date of January 2018. The administrative draft was provided to us in May of 2016, and then after staff comments, a revised draft was provided in early November 2016. This accelerated schedule allowed for the Northern and Southern coalitions to work together on a unified approach to the MPEP. So as you noted, David Corey will be here representing the Northern coalitions, and he'll speak to the coordination. Also, Thomas Harder, who has advised both the Northern and the Southern coalitions, is here to provide his perspective on the MPEP and answer questions about nitrate and groundwater. And I want to commend the Southern coalitions for meeting early and often with Water Board staff. We really appreciate how receptive they have been to our input. On May 23rd, our executive officer conditionally approved the work plan, finding that it generally addresses the irrigated lands order's objectives. So with that, unless you have questions for me, I will turn it over to Casey Kramer and John Dickey, representing the South San Joaquin Valley MPEP committee, to describe their work plan.
I see no questions. Okay. You did such a good job.
Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, Dr. Longley. This is one thing one was Sue. She said I should put good morning in the presentation, but it is good afternoon. Before I get started, let me just, Sue McConnell has been an absolute pleasure to work with. Water Board has great staff here, and we're very appreciative of their efforts in working with us. A lot of good input from her and Adam Lapitz and Clay Rogers and Glenn Meeks and the staff, and what we're presenting here to you today. Briefly again, Casey Kramer, I'm the coordinator of the Kings River Water Quality Coalition and also the coordinator of the Southern San Joaquin Valley Management Practices Evaluation Committee. To my right is Dr. John Dickey. He is our technical program manager for the MPEP process. So the Southern San Joaquin is a collection of 7 water quality coalitions implementing the group option under the order. And that it also includes, in addition to Kings, the Cahuilla Basin, the Tule Basin, Kern, and 3 water districts within Kern, Coelho, Buena Vista, and Westside Water Quality Coalition. So we're doing this on behalf of that group. And real briefly, the structure of the presentation here this afternoon, I'm going to talk a little bit about the process that we undertook and a little bit about the approach. And then Dr. Dickey is going to go into a little bit of the details of one of the main components of the program, but not the entire program. We don't have enough time to really give you the details of everything that we're doing. Then I'll offer some closing remarks at the end. But probably just to start off with is maybe some of you are sitting up there wondering, why did we submit it early? That's probably an unusual thing that a group of permittees do. Usually you get plans right before they're about to do, and then there's a lot of discussions with staff. But there's a lot of reasons that went into that, but probably the single thing is that this MPEP program, as it was negotiated and put into the order a long time ago, is the single most important element of this program, not just for the water board, but also for the growers that we work with and represent. So it is the assessment of groundwater impacts, and it's also the tools and that will go back to growers, and eventually, from putting on my grower hat, it's the things that's going to tell them how they have to farm into the future. So we take it very, very serious because it is the single most important thing, and it's important that we get this right. Briefly, an overview of the process. The 7 coalitions, we started talking shortly after the order was adopted. Had some early efforts of meeting up in UC Davis, meeting with researchers, meeting with commodity groups, meeting with several people. And then we've established a coordination agreement with the 7 entities. We put out a request for qualifications. Good process put in place. We got several quality firms that applied to help us put together this program. But one of the key things that we put in that coordination agreement is looking for technical expertise that had knowledge of the regulatory program, knowledge of cropping systems, agronomic effects, also knowledge of groundwater conditions. But probably the single most important condition that we put in that RFQ was knowledge of the technical work and the regulatory processes underway with CV salts. Really took the long-term view on this program and said, how is this going to eventually work its way through, and did not want to reinvent the wheel, wanted to look at the stakeholder processes and the technical work that was underway at CV salts and have people that had trust, not just from the agricultural community, but also from the water board perspective, and also had a very solid foundation of technical expertise. We've been meeting monthly for almost 2 years now with the technical team in putting together the work plan, not just the work plan that you're seeing, but all the work behind the scenes to actually implement the program. With regards to approach, I mean, as John Constantino said, this is not, there are no easy things that we have to do. This is right here, this MPEP program is a very difficult assignment. It's never been done before to my knowledge. But the key is that we already have large investments in place. The agriculture community and the scientific community, research community has been doing a lot of work in these fields. And so we didn't need to reinvent the wheel. We just kind of needed to add some direction towards water quality that maybe wasn't there in the past, and add some horsepower to it, get it moving a little bit faster in the direction that you guys wanted it to see, and that our growers are moving towards already, but to try to get it to move a little bit quicker to meet all the compliance obligations. The work that we're planning on doing and have started, it really builds on the CV salts regulatory approach. There was an Alta Irrigation District archetype, many of the same elements of the technical work and the discussions, the stakeholder involvement has already occurred through the CV salts process in the Alta Irrigation District, and that's been approved and by this board. What we're doing is really adding some work to that to refine it and improve it, and so that we can move forward and expand it and broaden it to additional areas. The basic approach is one, when it comes to research work, is really integrating ourselves with the UC, the cooperative extension, farm advisors, commodity groups, growers, CCAs, the whole community, to make sure that what we're doing is not is in line with what they're doing. We don't need to go out and do a completely new research study. What we need to do is work with people like Dr. Harder, who are already doing a lot of this important work, and say, can we add on to this study to do this, this, and this, because we need this for the MPEP program. So that's a core concept of what we're doing, is really trying to work very closely with the research community. It's also a soil and water assessment tool, or SWAT. which has been heavily invested in at the national and international levels and been peer reviewed. We're taking that model and the tool and improving it for use in California operations. It's already been put in use in the Alta project, and it's being expanded on. From that SWOT, there's an output of to groundwater quality and assessments. A very similar approach there is what the CV salts process did with taking root zone analysis down to groundwater conditions. And the team that we have is the team that actually did that analysis for the CV salts process. Probably the most important thing about our process and our approach is that I've been involved from the periphery of some of the very important research work in the past on air quality. And when you just go out and do a lot of research work and you just present it to the regulatory agency, a lot of times it's not believed or doesn't get implemented, or people have different expertise and different opinions on that research work. One of the efforts that I was involved with, it was on PM 2.5 and the percentage of PM 2.5 versus PM 10. Industry had one opinion on how much PM 2.5 was in PM 10, and the research community had a different assessment. So what they did was go out and do sampling, but they involved the researchers and the regulatory community up front in the entire process, and at the end of the day, when the results were done, everybody agreed with them. And so that's basically what we have to do here. This project is too big, too important to operate it in silos and then come at the end of the day and hand a report over the water board and say you should accept this. We have to include the entire the water board staff, the stakeholder communities, the broader community that we work with this program, so that at the end of the day this is something that can be trusted and approved by this board, because it is too important. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John and have you walk through just a few portions of the technical details. But again, this is a complex and work plan that we're planning on doing, and it's not by any ways the entire program. So John.
Good afternoon. So as Casey said, the broad charge of the MPEP is to relate management practices to water quality outcomes and to help achieve water quality progress by providing growers with actionable information. I'll focus on another charge, and that is the assessment of the influence of irrigated lands management on water quality outcomes. The task is daunting for many reasons. Not least of which is the vast scale and the variability of Central Valley cropping systems. We've got crops planted on something more than 6 million acres in the valley, well over 100 crops, depending on how you count. I think I heard 260 today from an earlier speaker. But about 25% of those crops, importantly, give you about 90% of the area. So there is an opportunity to focus and make some significant progress without digging into the most minor crops. About 30 to 35,000 irrigators, so lots of different people making independent decisions, and making decisions about 170,000 irrigated fields, depending on how you cut them up. Thousands of soil types underneath all those fields. So how will we approach this assessment to produce a comprehensible, credible set of results? Both for the use by growers but in making management decisions, and for the regional board and stakeholders to evaluate program performance. I think the answer that we're putting forward is to divide and conquer. It has long been recognized that root zone processes derive water quality results in agricultural systems, but not all by themselves. The upper crop soil part of the system exists in the context of a broader set of groundwater recharge sources that are themselves complex. Therefore, we must define an analytical framework that addresses not only the superficial system that we manage and control, but also the broader picture of aquifer or surface water quality relationships to what happens on the landscape. And that's an essential aspect of the work, that aquifers respond to things that happen on the landscape. And so we're not dealing with a point source. We're dealing with many, many, many sources that are well dispersed. Oh, sorry. So to analyze this, we need to identify representative suites of management practices for each crop. These are things that farmers really do. That we need to assess the performance of each suite in a variety of settings, and then determine what affects grower management decisions, because you can have management practices that exist in concept, but unless a grower actually does it, it doesn't matter. And then the combined effect of many decisions by many independent growers across the landscape and over time. So just another kind of let's look at two factors among the many I mentioned. This shows crop field delineations around Kerman, which is west of Fresno, containing a wide variety of crops. The crops aren't noted on the map, but what is shown clearly are the underlying soils. This degree of soil heterogeneity is not an extreme. I didn't cherry pick it. This is what soil maps look like all over the valley pretty much. Every crop by soil combination responds a little bit differently to climate and management, so each must be analyzed separately. So this illustrates why a robust, data-driven, computer-based, but somewhat streamlined tool set is what is needed. So that these important factors are not glossed over, but rather are fully considered. Fortunately, as part of the CV Salts program, as Casey mentioned, this challenge has been tackled and an archetypical methodology developed. This work was focused on Alta Irrigation District, which is southeast of Fresno, covering about 133,000 acres, or about 2% of the Central Valley's irrigated lands. Conceptually, this represents a sub-basin within which nitrate and salt might be managed under the CV Salts sort of framework. And this work was done for the regional board as part of the CV Salts process. So what does this methodology entail? The top story assessment considers factors driving water, salt, and nitrate movement through the root zone, really the part where you've got farmers acting and influencing the system the most greatly. Notably, the soil water assessment tool that Casey mentioned considers management along with other factors. It's important that you have a tool that doesn't just look at processes without considering what humans do to them. We have to be able to model management. In the archetype study, shifts to drip and microspray irrigation, which are real changes happening in Alta Irrigation District, and the more efficient use of N fertilizer, which is weirdly what's intended under the Irrigated Lands Program, those were the two main factors that were considered, both alone and in combination. Each model run corresponded to a given set of management conditions. And SWAT did a good job of characterizing the response of those sources to those changes. Root zone outputs are then combined with other factors that affect aquifer outcomes in a steady state groundwater model, which is the bottom story of the analysis. This portion predicts outcomes of long-term shifts in aquifer management, which are really the kind of bottom line of the program. So you might ask, how does this analysis then inform grower management decisions? Because again, we have to get growers to act differently where that's really needed to protect water quality. This plot illustrates the relationship among environmental performance, so the y-axis, that's the amount of N leaching per year out of a field. The soil type this is arrayed across a whole range of soil types, and the soil types are, in this case, they're arrayed relative to their relative risk of nitrate leaching. So the more difficult to manage soils are way up on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side are soils that have a low tendency really to transmit nitrate to groundwater. And then we're looking at two curves that kick up near the right-hand end, and those represent two alternative response curves for two different suites of management. Remember, I talked about different suites of management that farmers can apply. So depending on the intensity of management, the rate of nitrogen leaching begins to increase as more challenging soil environments are encountered. So as you move to the right, eventually, it may be that your management practices just are insufficient to protect groundwater. And these are the places we're really interested in, because this is where our problems are. At some point, they exceed a desired performance threshold. By examining the results of this type for a specific crop by soil combination, so there would be a relationship like this for each crop that is looked at carefully. A grower can gauge whether or not they need to intensify their management system to achieve desired levels of water quality protection. So this is basically the analytical framework. So if you have a performance threshold that's sitting there, Suite 2, which is the blue line, hits that performance threshold at about relative nitrogen risk class 15. And so if you're something less than that, then, and you're using Suite 2, then you're performing. If you're somewhere to the right of it, if you have a more risky soil, you may need to reconsider your suite of management practices and pick something more aggressive. In some way, we have to bring the modeling information, these suites of management practices that growers really use or can use, and environmental performance together. And so this is the framework that we're suggesting in our work plan. Thank you very much.
So this isn't everything that we're doing, but this is one of the key components of what we're doing. And so we want to kind of give you a little bit of a taste, but really we wanted to be able to answer any questions that you may have, especially if they're technical. They're definitely towards John. But we do have a very comprehensive program, and we've been very proactive with pursuing this program. And because of that proactivity, we did submit a grant to the USDA and NRCS, and we were successfully awarded that on our first try, and it was the largest grant during that cycle period. We received maximum funding, and I'm told it was the highest grant they've ever awarded with CIG. So with that, in addition to it kind of fits in with our groundwater quality management plan and our MPEP program, we're going to be doing calibration and validation of the soil and water assessment tool to California cropping systems. We're going to be developing tools for growers to assess their own operations and implement guides and shifts in management practices, and help with assistance in outreach and implementation of improved management practices on the landscape. So we don't sit there and wait for a bunch of research to be done. We're actually getting out there with what we know now and aggressively pursuing those changes where they're needed. Probably the most important thing, or the last 2 points I'm going to make, is we've been working with various stakeholders in developing this work plan. We work closely with the Northern MPEP group. We've reached out to the Dairy Representative Monitoring Group and had a few discussions with them. We've been working as hard as we possibly could to integrate ourselves with the UC system and commodity groups, NRCS, their current programs. I've been working as closely and frequently as the regional board would allow us to do it, and also made presentations to the state water board as well. And we've reached out to a couple conversations and meetings with Laurel Firestone, the Environmental Justice Group, as well, so that she was well aware of what we plan to do. And we've also been talking about into the future and implementation, how we can make sure that we're closely integrated in implementing this program, so that their concerns are aligned with our work and what we're doing. But probably the most important thing I'll just leave you with is that what we're presenting here is the start of the process. I mean, a lot of work has gone into it, but it's the start of the process. It's not the end of the process. And ultimately, success on this program is going to be because all of us here in the room and outside the room are working together on identifying concerns and improving this plan and doing the work jointly and together. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions you guys may have. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions? As I mentioned this morning on past activities, Casey and I met for breakfast last Friday morning. And Casey, I appreciate the overview you gave to me, and particularly the focus that you provided on SWAT, Soil Water Assessment Tool. And as you pointed out, it's also being used by the Sigma folks. And it just strikes me that the kinds of things that we're doing, there's going to be a lot of carryover into the Sigma program on the issue of water quality. And I think that's public money well spent when we see that it's being used in other programs and has greater applicability. But I want to commend you on what you're doing. John, I'd like to have your assessment of SWAT for how it's performing insofar as what you're using it for now.
Well, our main application up to date was in Alta, and we've expanded it now so that it handles our larger domain. But the real test was how it reflected changes in management in terms of root zone leachate. And the type of response we got was pretty much what you'd expect. It's pretty much what you see in small plot research and monitoring. So that was what I wanted to see. SWAT, you could say in hindsight that it should do that. It's been vetted. It's a 30-year-old model or tool set, and the people who put it together are really good, and they're a large community, growing all the time. So it's supposed to be able to run without being a whole bunch of monitoring data being loaded into it. It's a physically based model, and that doesn't mean that we won't check it. We absolutely will. We know that's a crucial interest on the part of the regional board. They want to see real data compared with modeling results. But in terms of the model results, it did a good job of looking at the factors that I mentioned that we ran through it.
But as I understand, it's been used while it's been used extensively in the Midwest, it requires calibration here.
Well, it's been used all over the world, and it's been used in California. But yes, requires calibration. The main issues that we've identified have to do with our very productive cropping systems. Some of these crops, even 10 or 20 years ago, if you'd have told some garden variety agronomists in California they were going to be pulling 80 tons of tomatoes and these extremely high almond yields that we have, it just simply wouldn't have been thought possible. It's due to refinements in irrigation and fertigation that have been amazing. So those crop models, you really have to tune them up to get them to consume that much resource. So that's some work we've got ongoing.
Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, I'd like to ask Casey, don't know your coalition too well. I'd like to know more. How do you get them to come to the meetings? How do you get them to comply? What kinds of strategies are you thinking about, how to get them 100% compliant?
Thanks for the question. It's a difficult question. I think we probably have a little bit even of a harder challenge down in the South Valley. A lot of our growers were not even part of the surface water program before, so this is all new. But I guess we've had good success so far. But it is going to be an all of the above strategy. I mean, we do extensive outreach meetings throughout our area. I think we did 18 to 20 the year before, and did even more this year. We're doing web-based stuff and providing videos for growers. We're out there talking to commodity groups and trying to integrate ourselves into those programs. John just did a presentation to the cotton growers last week. I mean, we're just anywhere and everywhere. We're just trying to make ourselves available, and it's a tough challenge just within the Kings River area. We have roughly 5,000 individual growers. Many of those, the large number of growers, are very small growers who have other jobs and other things that they're doing as well. We've been trying to associate ourselves with the management firms, the Innovative Ag Services that was here earlier today that work with a lot of growers. So we're just trying to tap into the existing knowledge base, the existing relationships that growers already have, and make ourselves part of that new dynamic. So,
thank you.
Dr. Longley, I have a question. So, for example, the small growers, how do you reach out to them?
In our area, just outside of Fresno, we have a large Southeast Asian population. And I think just with any approach, you got to find people who they trust. And so that's what we've done. We work very closely with NRCS and UC, who already have those established relationships with those growers. And we've gone out and done specific meetings just for those particular growers. We had NRCS actually did the invites. We came and did the presentations. They were doing the presentations with us. And so depending on the issue, you just got to find people that they trust and respect and establish those relationships, and then allow them to bring you in to invitation to those growers. Is that responsive? Yeah. Okay.
Can you give me some thoughts on economics? These growers are in it to make a buck. I think the talk is they want to be good stewards, but bottom line, they got to make a buck. How are economics going to figure into your project?
I think for the most part, what we're doing is an assessment on water quality, an assessment between the different management practices, and probably what's going to be defined as protective practices moving forward. I think the economics part of this comes at the later date when you start looking at different practices that maybe somebody can implement versus some crazy practice that could be that would if there was some practice that would make groundwater quality protective tomorrow, I think that would be great. But I think at the later stages of this process, when you look and start comparing practices, there are probably going to be some cost implications there in determining what's best practical treatment and control. But we're not really doing that up in front of this project.
Any further comments or questions? Well, thank you very much. And Casey, I need to commend you for taking a strong leadership role in making this thing work. Next, David Corey.
Excuse me. Chair Longley, members of the board, my name is David Corey. Here representing the Westside San Joaquin River Watershed Coalition, and also here presenting on behalf of the Northern MPEP group, which is comprised of the Sac Valley, who's Bruce, I think, is still here somewhere. There he is, yeah. Sac Valley, the Delta Coalition, the East Side Coalition. Perry Clausen is off picking nectarines right now, which I think we're all very happy that he's doing that, because we will hopefully be able to get some later.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, so hit him up at CV Salts. So the East Side, West Side, or the Westlands Coalition and the West Side Coalition, I think I got them all there. I think, Casey and John did a good job of articulating the importance of this MPEP process, the program, and the challenges we face in doing this. This is really an enormous task that we are undertaking, an essential and important task, but really is challenging. In looking at this with the Northern Group, we realize that it's really important for us to coordinate with the South Valley in this effort so that we can minimize some of the costs of doing this, because these are going to be quite expensive programs and really dictate, as Casey said, how many growers may have to farm, and that's going to have broad implications to all growers in the Central Valley. So we want to make sure that we have a coordinated approach, especially on when you talk about the SWOT model and the soil and water assessment tool, of having consistent tools that we're using to analyze growers' impacts on water quality. So we're committed to working with the South Valley in their development of that tool, which is expanding not only to the South Valley, but up into the entire Central Valley, so that we're utilizing a consistent tool and can work with that tool to figure out how that management practices actually integrate to water quality down below. That's pretty much all I have, and I appreciate working with them and appreciate the board's staff working with us and trying to develop this really aggressive and challenging program. I assume that as we move along, we're going to learn more and more, and probably have to adapt this program to really answer the difficult questions we've been charged with.
Thank you very much. Questions for David? I don't have any questions today.
All right.
Thank
thanks.
you. Thomas Harder?
Thomas Harder, Professor and Corporate Extension Specialist at University of California, Davis. It is my pleasure to be here today. Thank you for the invitation to speak briefly. I've been involved in this process as well as in the dairy order and CV salts process for a long time. And I think one of the things that stands out with the MPP program and the efforts on the irrigated land regulatory program, that it is a unique process, and it's done at a very high quality. And I appreciate having been able to work both with your staff, with the coalitions, as well as with the environmental organizations. And I appreciate that that we have this dialogue, and that with the work that we have done on the research side and with our extension mission from Cooperative Extension, we've been able to participate in this process. I thought perhaps as a way of sort of bringing to you a university or an academic perspective, I'll step back very briefly to the principles behind the irrigated lands regulatory program and where the MPEP fits in. Sue showed a very beautiful slide that shows all of the different elements that are in the irrigated lands regulatory program where the management practice evaluation program fits in. And I thought perhaps another way to put it into perspective is to remind you what you do and what you've seen today in some of the earlier presentations, and thank you for having us all here all day. Is in a lot of your programs when it comes to waste discharge, you're looking at a point of discharge, and some of these programs are able to say to the discharger, you need to have this technology in place, and we're going to have your monitoring. We're going to have a monitoring tool at the pipeline where you discharge, and that's going to be our way of knowing whether or not you're in compliance. And we do this with wastewater treatment plants. There's technology and there's discharge monitoring. We do that with underground storage tanks. There's technology around that, and we do groundwater monitoring. And we just talked about lagoons. There's technology, and if that is in place and you have the groundwater monitoring in place, you're all good. As was pointed out, with irrigated lands, we're talking about 170,000 fields that are all next to each other. We're talking with a large number of entities, and it's very difficult to do that kind of monitoring, and having a tool available that you can just stick next to each one of these fields that tells you what the waste discharge is to groundwater, no less. Not to surface water, but to groundwater, no less, which is this hidden resource. And so to get around this fact that we don't have that stick, that measuring stick that we can put underneath each one of these 170,000 fields, the program that you see is what has evolved, and it consists essentially, besides a lot of the assessments and planning programs, at the core it consists of three things that will give you the information in lieu of that one measuring stick. It's the farm evaluation and nutrient management reporting that each of the growers does every year to the coalitions that the coalitions assemble for you and report to you in an aggregated format. That tells us something about the amount of nitrogen that's applied and the amount of nitrogen that is removed. It's a basic mass balance, and the difference, as well as the ratio, is an indication of, let me put it this way. The difference is an indication of how much nitrate may be moving to groundwater. The ratio is an indication of how well the grower does relative to other growers. It's a good tool for saying, overall with your management practices, you're doing well. So that's what we're getting from the grower. But that doesn't tell us exactly what's happening at the groundwater table. To figure that out, that's where the management practice evaluation program comes in. That's trying to figure out, so if we know these numbers from the nutrient management reporting and from the farm evaluation reporting, what does that mean for us with respect to groundwater? And so all of the work in the MPEP, part of the work in the MPEP program is to figure out that link between the numbers we actually get reported by the individual growers and what that means with respect to groundwater. The flip side of that coin is what do the coalitions need to tell the growers that they need to do to actually meet groundwater quality requirements. So that's the MPEP program. And then the third piece that Sue also pointed out is the regional trend monitoring program for groundwater. So rather than having monitoring wells on or next to each one of these 170,000 fields, there is essentially a statistical process, just like that sort of surveying groundwater to get to an overall state of groundwater. It's much like we do polls before presidential elections. We don't ask everybody, what are you going to vote for? We ask a few people, what do you want to vote for? And we get a fairly good idea of what may happen in a big election, except for the last one. And so we're polling groundwater at certain locations to get an idea of the bigger picture, whether we're going into the right direction or not. So that's sort of the bigger picture context for me of this management practice evaluation program. Dave just now talked about the fact that there is a cost savings when these coalitions coordinate their various efforts. I see it slightly different. There's a cost savings, yes, but I think having the coalitions work together on this MPEP program, there's more minds wrapping their heads around a big challenge. There's more ideas, and more importantly, the many ideas can get coordinated and put together in a more consistent framework. We do need a lot of different efforts in this program, both in terms of the field work that needs to be done and in terms of the modeling that needs to be done, and there's many different ways to do both of that. I'm involved through the research that I do with my colleagues and in my group in a number of efforts dealing with assessing nitrate and how much nitrate we possibly lose out of our landscape, understanding how we monitor the root zone around these crops, but also understanding how we monitor groundwater and how we assess groundwater quality. As was mentioned earlier, around both of these areas, the field work and the modeling work, there's a body of knowledge that already exists that we can take advantage of already, and from which we can, and the coalitions are planning to develop immediately programs that they can extend with their partners to the growers in order to improve management practices. There's other questions that are still open that we don't know. And I'll give you a little bit of historic context of this, and why that is. There has been in the water arena, in the agricultural water arena, there has been a lot of work understanding the impact of agricultural management practices on watersheds. That has been part of the Federal Clean Water Act. There have been a lot of regulatory programs, a lot of voluntary programs around that. Your pyrethroid program that you heard about today, which is part of pesticide program, speaks to those efforts. Where we have not done a lot of research over the last 30 years is on how agriculture impacts groundwater quality. When I go to national conferences, water conferences that deal with specifically with agriculture, I'm one of a handful of people among a crowd of hundreds of people that deal with water and agriculture, and there's a handful of us that deal with groundwater and agriculture. And that's because the Federal Clean Water Act deals specifically with surface water and protection of surface water, whereas California, with its Porter Cologne Water Quality Control Act, also includes discharges to groundwater. And so we're sitting a little bit on our own, and the Irrigated Lands Program, the Dairy Program, and CV Salts are really the cutting edge in terms of regulatory programs that deal with this interface between groundwater and agriculture. And that's why we don't already have a large body of field research work that deals with understanding specifically the groundwater quality impacts from all the many different agricultural practices that are going on in California. And so I just say this by way of providing some background why there's not already this reliable literature out there, and why we do need time to perform the research that's needed to inform this program. And so the program, I'm impressed that this program is essentially structured now as an adaptive management program, and that as we're moving forward, the critical piece is going to be to do what we know now and extend that knowledge and bring growers on board with that knowledge, but at the same time not say this is not the end game. We're going to learn more as we move forward, and as has been mentioned, and we need ways to bring that back into the implementation programs that come with this irrigated lands regulatory program. That all said, I think that was the main point I wanted to make, and again, my appreciation to everybody who's been involved in this program. I think this is going at a very high quality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. Are there any questions for Thomas? You know, he's a professor. You get him going, he'll go at 50-minute segments. He could probably go all day.
So I've got a question for him, Professor Harder. Previous talk, had a nice picture of soil series maps, and in the discussion for optimizing water and nitrogen to minimize leaching, not seeing enough talk about soil series. Would you agree that we ought to be paying more attention maybe to soils? I think that's what the previous project was really about, was moving into precision farming. So you've got your tomato field that's large and cuts across 2 different soils. Well, in the Midwest, we're widely looking at.
I think that's exactly what the previous presentation was about. Yeah. We're going to be doing field work. If you look at the number of crops we grow in California, and as Casey mentioned, we have thousands, or John mentioned, we have thousands of different soil types and soil series in California. It's easy to say you got to reduce the difference between how much nitrogen you apply and how much nitrogen you harvest. The real magic is to actually implement that in practice, because in order to implement that in practice, you have to deal with your particular crop and with your particular soil to make that magic happen. And knowing more about how to do that and under what conditions that will work, that's part of the work that the MPEP is proposing. We can do field work on some crops, and we can do field work on some of those crops for some soils. We're going to be limited in how many of these combinations we can really do. And we want to learn as much as possible from those, and then use the models to kind of learn the rest. I think we learn a lot of really critical and significant things in our field work, and we've always used models to sort of then extend it to the other situations. And that's where these models become very important, whichever one it is, and certainly the SWOT model that's been proposed for this is among those models the longest used and the most well-researched and built-out model that's out there that includes farm management practices.
Carl, I wanted to thank you for the framing a little bit, because I've thought about this occasionally, that we are doing a lot of this because of Port Cologne, and I think the visual image that you portrayed of going to a conference with 500 people and there's 4 or 5 of you talking about groundwater issues with farming water is emblematic of the cutting edge nature of what we're doing. And I was kind of curious, so have you seen this in other parts of the world? I mean, in the United States, we're kind of it in a lot of ways, but
yeah.
But are there other parts of the world where they're looking at some of these similar issues?
We've organized a couple conferences over the last 10 years, specifically looking at groundwater and agriculture for exactly that reason. I put this conference together in 2010 and again last year. The places that are engaged in this are the European Union, where the Water Framework Directive, with its various sub-directives, is actually not unlike the combination of what we now have between the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, Port Cologne, and integrated regional water management. There are a lot of similarities between the Water Framework Directives and the set of groundwater-related regulations we have here in California. Australia is working on this. I have a group of New Zealand researchers coming in the fall. They're looking at these same issues in New Zealand. And importantly, Europe, New Zealand, Australia are all looking at ways, and have been looking at ways on how do you create policy around this issue when you don't have a stick that you can put into the ground everywhere. And I think the programs that you have created with this board and with your stakeholders are really at the cutting edge of this, and very progressive. in the way they're putting together all the various tools.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I will volunteer for the committee to set up sort of sister cities or farming communities to visit each other in New Zealand and Europe. So.
Well,
Carl's already doing that.
We can function on that together, I think. You got a lot of volunteers there.
I mean, I joke, but what you just told us is really important. I don't know how much our staff is engaged in some of that literature from these other places. I suspect they're way on top of a lot of that, but I think that's a story that we haven't really told very much, and I think it's an important one.
To look at it from the other side, and I think you've told me this in the past, Thomas, looking specifically at Europe, in the Western Europe, Scandinavian countries, so forth, where they've had extensive animal operations, confined animal CAFO operations, they are experiencing the same kind of problems we have here. Is that correct? Also, I think in the Rhine Valley, over extensive, for many centuries probably, of using primarily manure and human excrement for fertilizers, they have extensive problems, primarily on grapes. They have extensive groundwater problems. Is that correct?
That's correct. If you look at Europe, the places that are most vulnerable for groundwater contamination are Denmark, Holland, northern Germany. You got very sandy soil, you have very shallow groundwater, and in Denmark and Holland, you also have a population that depends significantly on groundwater as a source of drinking water. And so those are the countries that also have taken among the most progressive approach to dealing with this, with extensive research programs. On one hand, engaging their academic partners with stakeholder processes that engage the agriculture community, and extensive monitoring programs. I think where we in this country are maybe further than some of the European countries with cooperative extension. We have, in fact, an institution with cooperative extension and also with the many agricultural organizations that come with USDA. We have actually a system of farm advising and farm extension to the growers that's unlike anything else in the world, that provides an opportunity to directly work with growers. And that's something to think about as we move forward. I think putting out recommendations is one thing, but as Board Member Markham knows, actually getting growers to do this and getting them to implement this is a lot of one-on-one work. And one of the challenges, I think, of this program is to think through how we get there with the limited amount of personnel that's out there actually doing the footwork.
Yeah, and I wanted to add, this isn't just our story. This is a story of, as you alluded to just then, about the farming community and how they've had to step up to understand and find ways to address a lot of these issues. And there's like the ag leadership groups that often travel, and maybe that's an opportunity for them to do some exploration in that realm with some of these other countries that share the similar challenges that we're facing and addressing.
Yep.
The communication issue that we're talking about now, I think is one of our biggest challenges, to be able to get the proper one-on-one possibly, or small group experience for folks that are tilling the ground.
I think it is, and I think one of the what I hear from the environmental groups and what I hear from the board as well is the question of what targets can be set in that environment. How do we set a goal or interim goals that we can meet with growers? That how do we set metrics around how many growers are going to perform which management practices? At this point, what is our next performance measure, and how can we do that? And so I think we're going to continue having discussions around that.
Well, I mentioned earlier about I thought there was an important role for CDFA here. I'm told that there's been meetings, and we know that CDFA has is working out there. I just think that meetings like we've had today, certainly ought to be a CDFA rep here. I can't make that happen, but we're talking about things that involve CDFA very much. They're one of many players, but he was here. That's good to hear. That's good to hear. I didn't.
I'd like to ask Professor Harder. We're requiring a collection of massive amounts of data, and it's costly. Are there smarter ways we can direct the collection of this data to paint a better picture of where we're at now, as well as follow things into the future?
I don't, I think at this point, the program that has been put in place is where it is. I know there's discussions with the State Water Board in terms of how much more transparent it should be, how much data stays with the coalitions and what data are being in the public domain. But I think the program, the farm evaluation program, and the nitrogen management planning program are a solid and very robust basis for moving forward on this. I think with the irrigated lands program, unlike with the dairy program, you have the coalitions that will actually take those data and process those data and make them readable and processable and digestible in ways that are informative or can be informative. Most importantly, they're going to be in a digital format, so folks like me can take them and do something with them on the researchy side. And the dairy program is still a program where records come in on paper, and it's very difficult to then deal with the large number of records that come in on an annual basis. So no, I think we're in the irrigated lands umbrella program, we're on the right track.
Any further comments?
Well, not to him, but to the overall body, I'll wait.
Okay. Thank you very much, Thomas.
Thank you.
Appreciate your appearance here. Debbie Orris.
Good afternoon. Again, Debbie Orrs with Community Water Center. I'll make my comments brief because I think we're all tired. But first I want to thank, working with Sue on this and Casey, appreciate engaging Community Water Center and the environmental justice stakeholders in this process. I want to raise a couple concerns that were addressed in our letter, but were not addressed in the staff comment letter. A lot of our concerns are around lack of specificity of what's going to be done and when, and I understand that there needs to be some level of flexibility as we're moving forward, but a little bit of understanding of what are the next steps would be helpful. So how will the impact of best practices on groundwater be measured? We are also concerned a little bit about what kind of cost-benefit analysis is being considered. Usually cost-benefit analyses just look at cost-benefit to the regulated public, not to the communities who might be impacted. How will the findings be implemented on a site-specific basis? And finally, what will members be required to implement? It seems that in the meetings that we have been attending, there seems to be an acknowledgement that a grower will only implement practices appropriate to his or her operation. However, it's uncertain how a regulator assesses whether that grower is actually implementing BPTC if they're not implementing the suite of practices determined to be protected by the MPEP. So I think these are all things that, as moving forward, we'll be able to address, and we can look forward to continuing to work with staff and with the coalition.
Any questions? Go ahead, Bob.
No, I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that the environmental justice community, social justice community, is also a critical component of the story of our region and pushing us forward. And that's been really important too. So there's a lot of pieces to the story, but it's a story that needs to get told more, I think. So thanks.
Thank you for that.
And your comments have been noted, particularly in my mind, when it comes to the appropriateness of the various best management practices for the particular operation. Any further comment or question? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have a card for Joe Mello, but I don't see Joe Mello in the audience, and I suspect that Joe Mello, who didn't have a card for number 9, put the wrong number on the card.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened.
So do you want to talk, Bruce? I don't have a card for Bruce, but Bruce has turned in so many cards in the past that,
That's on. Okay. It's not green. Chairman Longley, Bruce Howdeshelt, representing the Sacramento Valley Water Quality Coalition. Hadn't intended to talk, but just wanted to echo some of the things said and then respond to cost and outreach and education and address you as board members, not commissioners, which I did earlier. So Thomas put it well. This is adaptive management. And adaptive management is been going on a long time. And as board member Markham knows, and most of you know, and as a former Yolo County Ag Commissioner once told me, I reserve the right to be smarter today than I was yesterday. And a lot of agriculture does that. I remember the Gabrielle Ludwig with Dr. Ludwig with the Almond Board saying, you know, we used to put all of our fertilizer in the fall in the 80s. Now we feed it with spoonfuls. And so yield's going up, and it is a win-win. It's a program that makes sense, CENTS and SENSE. And you can look at cost and you can look at value. And what the Southern San Joaquin MPEP is bringing forth is a strategic value, as Dr. Harder said, an adaptive management program. And it looks at the entire valley. And as board member Markham, Dr. Markham knows, and you know, Dr. Longley, from visiting Alturas, the valley in the north in the upper watershed is very different from the Tulare Lake. So this looks at it in a very strategic, adaptive way to do that, and it's very valuable. And value is what we always strive for, regardless of what the cost is. Think of this as 4 C's, maybe 3 C's. Coalition, commodities, cooperative extension, UC, which is not really a C, but is a C. And that's how you get to the education and outreach. And it takes a lot of voices, talking to a lot of folks to make sure that they understand what the value is here and how it mutually benefits. I think Casey is very astute in engaging the environmental justice community, as we've done in CV Salts. Because as a former board member, Dan Odenweiler said, you know, farm workers and agriculture go hand in hand. Disadvantaged communities are integrated in the agricultural community, so it is in the best interest of agriculture to ensure the water quality is the best. And the last thing is, I want to stress, in Sacramento Valley Water Quality Coalition is organized differently. You've heard me say this previously. So we have 13 sub-watersheds, and each of those sub-watersheds has someone who is known in that area, either a farm bureau or a long-standing farming family, and that helps us communicate the message. In board member Markham's area, it was Pam Giacomini, a agricultural family from that world. Now it's Tammy Humphrey. You know, in Dixon Solano, it's the Curry family who's been there for 5 generations. And so we have multiple ways to get that education and outreach, and almost, and equally as important, get that feedback as these programs are developed to make sure they have that agronomic influence and importance. So remember, 3 C's or 4 C's: coalition, commodities, cooperative extension, UC. Bye.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you very much. That's a good way to wrap it up. Are there any comments by the board before we adjourn till tomorrow?
Yeah, I just wanted to, of course, commend Sue for her hard work, and the time got changed, but you still got the job done. And then just to acknowledge the Southern Coalition and them getting their plan in ahead of time. I've been so impressed as my time on the board of the coalitions, because it makes a difference when you bring everybody together, the stakeholders, the EJ groups, to discuss the issues, and then you come to a consensus and agree on what needs to happen to improve water quality. So hopefully it's going to help get the Northern Coalition moving on to the same effort. But commend all of you. Thank you very much for the delay that we had to do today, and that's it.
And I thank you again, Sue, but you're very adaptable, I've noticed. You always do a good job, whatever time of the day we put you come up.
Can I just correct, the northern part of the coalitions are working and have been. Okay, so I didn't.
know, but they said the
Yeah.
Southern Coalition had completed their work plan, so.
David Corey, I could not turn you down, again.
I apologize, David Corey with the the Northern MPEP group. I probably didn't clarify as well as I should have in my first statement, but the Northern group is working hand in hand with the Southern group on developing this SWAP model. We're working on an MOU to sort of clarify that coordination and make it, sort of the internal coordination, but we are agreeing to do that same program to develop that SWAP model and expand it to the entire Central Valley. So that's why we didn't have two different proposals in terms of the MPEP, because at this point we're doing the same effort, and that says how coordinated we are. They speak for us on that matter. So if I didn't clarify that as well as I should have, I apologize.
I understood that. I just wanted
Okay.
to give Southern Coalition kudos.
Oh, I give them kudos as well. They're doing a great job. Yeah.
That's a good way to end, and it is, we have 3 minutes approximately or 2 minutes before 5, so we're done before 5. And we are, we'll stand recessed until tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, 9 a.m. And then we are going to have a couple of important items on the agenda, and we'll go from there.